We are Novels Hall Dynasty. If you want to listen to more novels or more chapters of this novel, visit a path with the name of Novels Hall Dynasty. We continue with the novel. Nightfall. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Beginning. A long time ago, there were many unknown places, in which there lived many unknown people. The sun was a massive fireball setting in the distance of the wilderness, radiating blistering red flames, retracting at a slow continuous decline. The newly sprouted moss that had appeared after the snow melt had spread everywhere, and resembled burn scars. Silence prevailed, only to be interrupted by the occasional screech of an eagle or the trotting sound of gazelles in the distance. There were 3 individuals that stood in the open and barren wilderness, and under a small tree is where they had gathered. They didn't greet one another. Instead, all 3 of them were looking down in tacit unison, as if something under the tree had sparked their interest and was worthy of careful inspection. There were 2 ant colonies fighting around the tree's roots that had broken through the icy soil. Perhaps a home as perfect as this was truly hard to find in this desolate place, and the battle was getting brutal, instantly leaving thousands of dead ant bodies behind. This might have sounded very tragic and bloody, though, in reality, all that was left was a peppering of little black dots on the ground. The weather was frigid, but the 3 individuals weren't wearing much, as if cold didn't bother them at all. They kept watching attentively, until one of them broke the silence and whispered, "In this worldly kingdom of ants, wherefore is the Grand Tao?" He was a slim, short and boyish-looking lad, wearing a pale blue collarless shirt, and he was carrying a sheathless, thin wooden sword. His jet-black hair was carefully combed into a bun and held in place with a wooden fork that looked like it could slip out at any time, but at the same time, it remained unshakably rooted, firmly, like a pine tree. While the chief monk was preaching, I saw countless ants flying up as they bathed in the sunlight. It was a young monk who spoke this time. He was dressed in tattered cotton cassock, and there was black, sharp, stubble sprouting from his scalp. This somehow resembled the strength and determination written on his face and conveyed by his words. Ants may be able to fly, but they will fall eventually. They shall never touch the sky, the lad carrying the wooden sword exclaimed as he shook his head. If you hold this belief, then you will never be able to understand the true meaning of the Taoist heart, said the young monk as he slowly blinked his eyes, still looking down at the warring ant colonies. I heard your temple dean recruited a new child disciple with the surname of Chen. Then you should understand that you would never be the only prodigy at a place like the Zhishao temple. The lad with the wooden sword raised an eyebrow and replied with a sneer, I will never understand how someone constrained like you is qualified to represent Zhuangkong Temple as its wayfarer in the world. The ants will fly, just like they will fall. However, they are better at climbing, and they are good at letting their fellow ants climb upon them. They are not afraid of sacrifice, and as they pile upon one another, as long as there are enough of them, they shall eventually pile up high enough to touch the sky, said the young monk as he ignored the defiant comment and continued gazing at the anxiously scurrying ants below. Amidst the increasing twilight, an eagle screeched sharply, sounding terrified. Perhaps it was the 3 strange individuals standing under the tree, or maybe it was the imagery of an enormous pile of ants that had reached the sky, or could it be something else entirely? I am really frightened, the wooden sword lad admitted abruptly while straightening his thin shoulders. The young monk agreed by nodding, even though his facial expression remained just as calm and determined. The 3rd youth standing under the tree was of strong build and wrapped in clothing that resembled animal skin. His naked legs were as solid as rock, and under the rough skin, the muscles seemed to contain explosive strength. He had remained quiet, without uttering a word, and yet the goosebumps on his skin exposed how he really felt at that very moment. These 3 young men came from the 3 most mystical places of the universe, wayfaring this world under the order of their respective sects. They resembled the brightest of the stars across the world, but even they could not help but sense an overwhelming fear as they stood here in the wilderness on this day. Eagles should not fear ants, since they are simply black dots to the former. Ants should not fear eagles either, because they are not even worth a bite to the eagle. The world of the ants had never seen or heard of a creature as powerful as the eagle, hence the latter remained unfathomable to the former. Nevertheless, over the span of many centuries and millennia, a few very distinguished ants among the crowd would, out of enigmatic reasons, decide to strip their gaze from the rotting leaves and just for once, gaze up at the crystal blue sky, and then, the world was never the same to them. The fear comes from seeing. The three youths were now looking at a shallow ditch only a few dozen feet away. There was nothing but darkness in the ditch, and it contrasted sharply with the mottled surface of the wilderness. The ditch had appeared out of nowhere about 2 hours ago and immediately stretched all the way off into the horizon as if it was hacked by an invisible ghost with a massive hatchet the size of a mountain, or drawn out by a pillar-sized brush used by the divine craftsman. This was utterly shocking, puzzling and terrifying. "I always thought Invariant Yama was just a legend," said the wooden sword lad as he stared at the black gash. According to the legend, Invariant Yama bore 70,000 offspring. Perhaps one of them happened to be wandering in this world. "Legend is just legend," said the wooden sword lad, with a poker face. "Legend says a sage shall be born every millennium, and who has seen one in the past few millennia? If you really didn't believe in it, why don't you dare cross that black slash?" No one dared to cross the shallow ditch, regardless of how proud or powerful they may be. Ants could crawl over it, insects could hop over it, gazelles could leap over it, eagles could fly over it, but not the humans. They dared not cross it, precisely because they are human. "If the child really exists, then, where is he?" asked the wooden sword lad as he gazed off at the horizon. By that time, the sun was almost set and darkness poured in from all directions while the temperature in the wilderness plummeted. A harrowing sensation began to unravel throughout the world. The dark night has befallen, and it is spreading everywhere. Where could you search in this? The youth in animal skin finally broke his silence. In contrast to his age, his voice sounded deep and coarse, its vibrations resembling that of a tumultuous river, or the sound of rusty blades being sharpened on rocks. Upon saying this, he left, in a rather peculiar way. Several flames suddenly flared up from his strong naked legs, wrapping his lower body in a burst of crimson red, while the howling wind rolled the fine rocks off the ground incessantly. Then, as if grabbed by a source of an invisible force, his body flew up more than 40 meters into the sky, then he was howling and pounding down on the ground, and with this impact he bounced up immediately. Like this, the youngster bounded away like a rock in a seemingly arbitrary manner, looking extremely clumsy yet with extraordinary strength and speed. "His name is Tang, just Tang. I don't know his full name." Thoughtfully, the wooden sword lad stated, "In another time and in another place, between him and I, only one will live." How powerful would his master be if the disciple is already so adept? "I heard his master has been pursuing the practice of 23-year cicada. I wonder whether he will end up carrying a thick shell once he emerges." There was nothing but silence. No one said anything. Puzzled, he turned his head. The young monk had his eyes tightly closed, his eyelids trembled, as if thinking hard about something that was truly perplexing. Actually, the young monk had withdrawn himself to this bizarre state ever since the other youth in animal skin spoke the words about the dark night. Sensing his gaze, the monk slowly opened his eyes and grinned, showing a sense of mercy instead of what used to be a determined and calm expression. Crushed flesh, blood, and what remained of his chewed-up tongue showed through his slightly parted lips. The wooden sword lad frowned upon seeing this. Slowly he removed his prayer beads from his wrist and solemnly put them back around his neck. The young monk walked away. His footsteps were heavy and steady, very slow, yet his shadow almost disappeared afar in an instant. Left alone under the tree, the wooden sword lad erased all emotion from his face, showing absolute calm, or more like an absolute indifference. Gazing at the rock-like bouncing shadow in the distant northern dust, he scoffed, "Evil devil." Then gazing off at the shadow of the young monk walking quietly towards the west, he stated, "Heretic outcast. Unworthy." The Tao of the evil devil and the heretic outcast is one that is unworthy. After making his statement, the thin wooden sword he carried on his back whistled and vibrated unprompted, suddenly turning into a ray of light as it shot up in a squeal, shredding the small tree into 53,333 parts, turning its leaves, branches, and trunk into a fine dust that was raining down onto the euphoric ants. The mute shall utter words, salt to be sprinkled to the bread. The young lad strolled towards the east while humming a song, and the little wooden sword followed quietly, drifting in the air just a few meters behind him. In the first year of the Great Tangshianqi era, the most extraordinary phenomenon had befallen the wilderness, gathering world wayfarers from all of the sects, to no avail. Starting from the day, Kinian, the successor of the Zhuangkong temple, never uttered another word as he began to practice a silent meditation. Tang, the successor of the devil's doctrine, had become a recluse off in the desert. His whereabouts still remained unknown. Yisu, the successor of Zhishaoabi, conquered his ultimate bottleneck and went about touring the nations. All three of them seemed to have gained something. Unbeknownst to the three of them, on that very same day, as the dark night was about to fall, on the other side of the black ditch that no one had dared to cross, by the side of a small pond not far from the capital, sat a scholar. A scholar wearing straw shoes and a ragged coat. The scholar seemed oblivious to the powerful and forbidding nature that the black ditch stood for. He simply sat there, with a book in one hand, and a wooden cup in the other. He read a book when he could, took a rest when he was tired, drank water when he was thirsty, looking perfectly happy and peaceful despite his thorough dusting. As the three people from afar left and as the sands managed to gradually fill up the shallow black ditch splitting the wilderness, the scholar finally stood up. He lightly dusted off his clothes, tied the wooden cup to his waist and carefully put his book back inside his coat. He then glanced briefly towards the direction of the capital before walking away. There was a long lane in the Chang'an capital. To its east sat the residence of the council official, and to its west sat the residence of the Xuanwei general. Albeit they were not considered top-notch officials, even though they boasted a deep sense of power and authority. While this area normally enjoyed a lovely peace and quiet, that was not going to be the case today. The residence of the council official was to receive good news, as the midwives were busy at work. Strangely, everyone from lords to young maids looked as if their joy was mixed with some other emotion, and no one dared to laugh. The maids holding water basins, rushing around the corner of the wall, even looked terrified as they overheard the noise coming in from outside. The famously fearless and valiant Xuanwei general Lin Guangyuan was no longer to be fearless or valiant, as he had displeased the empire's #1 fearless and valiant general Zhao. He had been accused of treason for colluding with the enemy, and after several months of interrogation by His Highness the Prince, the outcome was finally settled. The outcome was clear and the punishment simple: confiscation of all property and decapitation of each and every person in his family. The gates in front of the council official's residence remained firmly closed. The chamberlain nervously peeked through his gate at the similarly firmly closed gate of the general's residence. He could overhear the sounds of heavy blades hacking into flesh, and a sound that resembled watermelons rolling around the floor. He couldn't help but shiver in fear. The two families had been neighbors for many years, and he knew them well over at the general's residence, from the chamberlain to the gatekeeper. Listening to the terrifying sounds coming from across the lane, he could almost visualize the countless sharp blades cutting open their necks, their heads with their familiar faces rolling relentlessly on the courtside floor, then clashing with the door, and eventually piling together in a heaping bloody mess. Blood seeped under the gate of the general's residence, looking rather dark and sticky, like sticky rice puree mixed with cinnabar, containing some bits and pieces of flesh that looked like purple yam mash. The chamberlain stared at the sight, his face as white as a sheet. No longer able to contain his emotions, he doubled over while bracing on the door, and promptly began to vomit. Suddenly there was the hurried sound of horses approached from outside the gate, and people being chided, followed by abrupt knocking sounds. There was a faint cursing and then yelling that seemed to say that someone had escaped from the general's residence. From his horse, a private general of the prince's residence yelled his order at his men: "No one can go missing." Meanwhile, there were scratches and bloodstains on a wall in the inner gardens of the residence of the official of council. "Young master, please listen and obey. You must not go out. Let Ziyech go. Let him go, please." Inside a firewood shed not far from there, a blood-soaked chamberlain of the general's residence stared at a pair of 4-5-year-old boys. His lips trembled as he uttered deeply unpleasant and husky sounds, while his wrinkled and dirty face expressed nothing but despair and struggle, so much so that murky tears squeezed out of the corner of his eyes. It didn't take the Yulin royal guards long to find this firewood shed once they had broken into the official of council residence. Upon carefully inspecting the two dead bodies of an old man and a little boy, the lieutenant looked relieved and reported energetically, "All dead, none are missing." The easiest way to depict the term of unworldly sublime being is that sublime beings are normally unworldly, thus those who are unworldly tended to be sublime beings. This is quite obvious, though there is some sense in it. To the mere mortals, what the sublime beings fear is often out of their reach, and their joys are similarly unfathomable. As a result, the mortal world remained ignorant of what happened outside of their realm, while the unworldly would pay no attention to the deaths or births taking place in the mortal world. Just like they wouldn't care about a butcher's scale being tricked, a drunkard's cellar being chewed through by rats, the death of a Zuan-Wu general, or some government official welcoming a newborn daughter. There was never any connection between the joys and sorrows of the two worlds. It would take the power of a saint if a connection was ever to take place. In the suburbs of Chang'an capital stood a high-rising mountain that was mostly hidden up in the clouds. Along the steepness of its west side, a man was climbing up slowly. He looked very tall and strong from the back, wearing a black jacket over a thin shirt and holding a meal box. He finally managed to work his way against the wind and arrived at a cave. He sat down, opened the meal box, took out his chopsticks and picked a slice of ginger which he put into his mouth and chewed carefully, followed by another 2 slices of lamb, and let out a sigh showing pleasure and approval. Chang'an at sunset was soon to be obscured by the dark night, while a heavy rain and dark clouds were gradually approaching from afar. "It almost feels like I am seeing you like in the old times," said the tall man rather emotionally, as he gazed at some place within the capital. Then he raised his head to look at the sky, and pointing at it with his right hand, he said, "And you, what is the point of flying so high after all?" Obviously, he was talking to two different people. After a brief silence, the tall man downed his bowl of rice wine in one gulp, and held up the empty bowl and cheered in all directions around him, saying, "Wind blowing, rain falling, and the night shall be fall." As if in unison with his words, the wind came from beyond the mountain, blowing through his collar making a howling sound, and the old trees rooted on the rocks shook fervently while the mountain rocks kept falling. The cloud that hovered on top of the capital suddenly darkened, and countless threads of rainwater joined each other to splash down amidst the last shred of twilight. By the time he uttered the last word, a dark night had prevailed covering most of the sky, making it as black as the pupils of the king of hell. The man slammed down the wine bowl, and muttered angrily, "So damn black." Chapter 2. Reign in City of Wei. And a lad with a servant. In the spring of the 13th year of Xianqi era of Tang, there was rain in City of Wei. This military border town, which was located in the northwest of the extensive empire, was built to hold off the invasion of grassland barbarians. The cob walls were ramparted firmly around the city and they looked like a stocky earth block. When the northwestern wind started to blow in the dry seasons, the floating dust on the cob walls would flutter around and land on the crew barracks or the soldiers. The whole world would become ochre and there would be a sandstorm when people were turning their quilts during sleep. This rain was right in time and the soldiers were very pleased in this dry spring. The light rain was washing off the roofs, as if it could also wash people's eyes to be brighter. At least Ma Shixiang's eyes were pretty bright now. As the top military officer in the city of Wei, he was pretty humble now. He successfully covered his dissatisfaction with the footprints on the expensive carpet and pretended to act a little surprised. Saluting to the elder with a dirty robe sitting at a low tea table, he said in a low voice, "Dear sir, does the noble need anything? If she insists on leaving tomorrow, I could send 100 soldiers to protect her and make a record at the military ministry right away." The elder pointed at the figures inside the tent, shaking his head to agree with a smile. At that moment, a cold and arrogant woman's voice sounded in the tent. "That's okay. Just tend to your own business." It took very little time for Ma Shixiang to figure out who was in the carriage when they had crashed into City of Wei this morning. So he had no feelings about her cold attitude and didn't dare to complain. The person inside the tent suddenly spoke after a while. "The trip from City of Wei to the capital has to go through Min Mountain, right where the roads might have been washed out by the rain. Assign a guide from the army for me." Ma Shixiang was stunned and thought about that irritating guy. He lowered his head and said, "There is a candidate." Several lieutenants were staring at each other outside the barracks with different looks on their faces, some with regretful or shocked expressions. Apparently, none of them expected that Ma Shixiang would choose that person to be the guide for the noble. "General, are you really ready to let him go like this?" a lieutenant asked with surprise. City of Wei was very small, with less than 300 soldiers including the officers. It was more like a group of outlaws. The so-called general was really just a lowest-ranking officer. However, Ma Shixiang was strict with his soldiers, and as the head of the bandits, he liked to be called general. His subordinates didn't dare to talk to him without using the title general, even in the daily conversation. Ma Shixiang cleaned his face and looked at the tawny pools of water around the barracks. He sighed. "We can't always keep him in this damn place. The recommendation letter was received 6 months ago. That guy has a great future and he'll go to the capital to take his first test at the academy after all. Luckily, he could go together with that noble. Let me do her a favor. I don't think that noble will feel grateful," his lieutenant angrily replied. The door of the barracks was pushed open and a pretty maidservant walked in. She looked at Ma Shixiang and the lieutenants and coldly said, "Show me the guide." As the noble's maidservant, she didn't hide her slight arrogance when facing the military officers of the imperial court. The prime minister's gatekeepers, nobles' closest maidservants, and princes' retainers were the 3 most troublesome kinds of people in all of the bureaucracy. Ma Shixiang really didn't want to deal with them. So after chit-chatting for a few seconds, he called a lieutenant to go with the maidservant to find the guide. The rain temporarily stopped, washing the city of Wei clean. A few willows on both sides of the street sprouted. It was beautiful. But the city was so small that they didn't walk long to reach their destination, where there was a noisy barrack. There was a lot of noise in that house. The maidservant slightly frowned and thought, how could some people drink in the barracks in the daylight? As the door curtain was blown open, the sounds inside became clear. They were playing a finger-guessing game, but not the good sort. Listening to the noise, the maidservant's face turned red and she clenched her fists in her sleeves. "Let's play the lewd finger-guessing game. Who's dirty? You're dirty. Who's dirty? I'm dirty. Who's dirty? He's dirty." The noise kept up for a very long time and there was no winner. The maidservant grew angry, picked up a corner of the door curtain, and looked at those people irritably. She immediately saw a youngster at the other side of the square table. That youngster was 15 or 16 with a standard military, cotton-padded jacket, the front of which was full of oil and dirt. Maybe he had naturally curly black hair, or he hadn't washed his hair for a long time so it was oily and curly. However, he had an extremely clean face, therefore his eyebrows, as well as several freckles on his face were outstandingly clear. Who's dirty? You're dirty. The game was very lewd, as opposed to the youngster's expression which was significantly focused and serious. He looked holy and noble without any lewd qualities. He was gesticulating scissor, stone, and cloth with his right hand and it seemed that the game was more important than his life. Several green-headed flies with strong vitality were trying to land on the oil-tainted front of his cotton-padded jacket and were driven off by the youngster's fists. I won. The finger-guessing game was so long that it would cost all the air in the 2 battlers' lungs, and it finally came to the end. The black-haired youngster wielded his right arm to declare his victory and laughed happily with a cute dimple on his left cheek. But the youngster's opponent wouldn't surrender. He insisted that the youngster had changed his gesture during the final game. Therefore, they were arguing and every soldier in the room took sides. At this moment, a voice sounded from nowhere. "Follow the old rules. Sang Sang has the final say." Everyone looked at the corner in the room where there was an 11-year-old girl moving a bucket. She was short and thin, with dark skin and common eyes. She was wearing loose handmaiden clothes, which seemed to be stolen from somewhere by her master, and carrying a bucket which was heavier than herself. That little handmaiden named Sang Sang put down the bucket and turned around. The soldiers looked at her nervously, just like gamblers that were waiting for the dealer to reveal the outcome of a dice game. And obviously, it wasn't the first time for this scene. The little handmaiden frowned and gave the youngster a look. Then she looked at that angry soldier at the other side of the table and said seriously, "At round 23, you were showing a scissor and he a stone. But you said, 'He's dirty,' so you lost." The room was filled with laughter and the people cleared out of the room. The soldier paid unwillingly with dirty words. The youngster happily accepted the money, wiped it with the oil and dirt on his chest, and then touched the soldier's shoulder to comfort him. Take it easy. In City of Way, no, in the whole world, no one can beat Nink. The maidservant's face turned ugly, so the lieutenant's face was ugly too because he was observing her. He clutched the curtain in his hand and took a deep breath. He was trying to cough but was stopped by the maidservant. The maidservant stopped the lieutenant and followed that youngster and the little handmaiden as they left the barracks. She observed and watched quietly. No one knew what she intended to do, and the lieutenant had to believe that the noble's close supporters were all filled with eccentricities. That youngster named Nink didn't do anything special along the way. He leisurely bought some food and said hello to the fat aunt in the tavern. The only thing weird which made the maidservant feel strange and angry was that the thin little handmaiden was trying to drag the bucket, but the youngster wasn't willing to help. The empire was a strictly hierarchical state. But people here were simple and honest. Even in the capital Chang'an, where it was flashy and gloomy, the most indifferent noble couldn't see such a thin and weak girl of 11 or 12 carry the bucket so strenuously without being moved. "Are soldiers allowed to have a maidservant?" the pretty maidservant asked depressingly. The lieutenant scratched his head and answered, "Numerous immigrants rushed to the south and the borders during the years of the drought in Hebei province. There were dead people everywhere. It's said that Sangsang was saved by Nink from among the dead bodies, and because Nink was also an orphan, the two of them have lived together since then. And then he registered to be a soldier and his only condition was to take this little girl with him." He looked at the maidservant and carefully explained. "It's known that this isn't allowed in the army, but their situation is special. After all, we couldn't sentence a little girl to death. So everybody just ignored it." Listening to this explanation, the maidservant's face looked a little better. But when she saw Nink strolling with a grilled half-chicken and the little handmaiden dragging the bucket behind him with difficulty, her mood turned bad again. She coldly said, "This isn't living together, this is killing her." City of Wei was indeed small. Not long after, those four people arrived at a cabin in the south, with small stones on the ground outside. The cabin was surrounded by crude fences. The maidservant and lieutenant stood outside and looked at the cabin. The little handmaiden moved the bucket, which was half her height, to the water vat and stepped on the stool, tried her best to pour the water into the vat. Then she began to wash rice and vegetables. She took up a dust cloth to wipe the tables, chairs, doors, and windows before the rice was steamed, and sometimes her body was enveloped by the steam. There was a rain last night and left an ugly trace on the windows. The little handmaiden cleaned the traces of the raindrops and the cabin was soon clean and bright. Apparently, she did all this every day and she did it expertly. But still, there was compassion for her, seeing her working like an ant with sweat and a red face. There were no such feelings held by Nink. He lay on a bamboo chair peacefully with an old book in his left hand. He wrote on the wet ground while reading. When he ruminated with his hands stretching, a cup of hot tea was put into his hand. The soldier in City of Wei was familiar with this scene, so he wouldn't be surprised, but the maidservant wasn't. Especially when she saw the little handmaiden busy with cooking while looking after the lad, she became pensive. Chapter 3. The poverty-stricken yet wise lad. "It would be okay if she's your handmaiden, but didn't you find her among the dead bodies? Didn't you say you were kin to each other? And even if she was your handmaiden, don't you think she is way too young to bear such heavy chores? How can such a young man be so lazy? Why can't you just do things by yourself?" Perhaps this triggered bad childhood memories, or maybe her imagination of certain beautiful emotions were somehow sabotaged by this guy. The maidservant pushed open the gate and walked in and glanced at the bamboo recliner, more specifically at the old book that the lad was so absorbed in. She said acerbically, "Silly of me to think that you could be reading a masterpiece so majestic that it made you so immersed in it, but what do I see? Article on the Response of the Tao, a book that can be bought anywhere by anyone. Do you really think someone like you would have the privilege of entering the world of cultivation? Sitting upright, Nink looked curiously at this well-dressed young girl, who should never have shown up here in the city of Wei, and then turned his glance to the lieutenant, who was suffering in awkward silence. It's the only book I could find, so I have to live with it. I am just curious, not that I am expecting any privilege of course, he explained. The maidservant certainly wasn't expecting such a casual answer, and she suddenly didn't know what to say. As she turned to look at the little handmaiden pouring the coal ashes by the door, she said with an annoyed tone, "How do you even consider yourself a man of our great Tang Empire?" Looking perplexed, Nink frowned a little and followed her glance to see Sang Sang standing by the window in a stupor, still holding the dishcloth. He suddenly understood the reason of her sharp reproach. Smiling with a cute dimple, he said, "You are probably older than me, so why don't you just see me as a boy instead of a man?" The maidservant had never in her life come across such a thick-skinned and shameless person. With an ice-cold expression on her face and slowly clenching her fists, she was hardly able to contain her anger. But then she saw the handwriting drawn by tree branches on the ground, which seemed to leave her speechless. At the best barrack in the city of Wei, the elder, dressed in a ragged robe, sat there resting with his eyes closed, while Ma Shixiang, the border general, reported to the noble guest across the curtain with great respect and humility, even though he couldn't conceal his surprise. Perplexed, he asked, "You are not happy with the guide? May I ask why?" Sounding extremely disappointed, the noble behind the curtain chided. "I need a guide who is highly capable and intelligent, not a lazy, weak, and useless lad who is immersed in his cultivation dreams. Is he even capable of tying up a chicken?" Awkwardly, Ma Shixiang tried to explain. "As far as I am concerned, while still young, Nink has actually chopped off the heads of many barbarians of the grassland in the past few years. I mean, tying up a few chickens should certainly not be a problem. The Great Tang was an empire that holds military honor in high esteem. And when this honor was at risk, Ma Shixiang chose to retaliate without hesitation, despite the high rank and prestige of the person behind the curtain." The sarcasm in his response was proof of his attitude. "Is a killer equivalent to a good guy then?" replied the cold voice from behind the curtain. Even more subserviently, Ma Shixiang went on to explain. "Among the 300 soldiers in the city of Wei, Nink certainly isn't the one who killed the most enemies, but I can bet my life that this lad can ultimately survive any battle, regardless of how bad the circumstance might be." Then he raised his chin and said with a smile, "Thanks to the accumulation of his medals, he has already been recommended by the military ministry. The boy did a good job and successfully passed the first examination 6 months ago, and he will be checking into the academy as soon as he gets back to the capital this time." Upon hearing about the academy, there was a sudden silence behind the curtain, and the noble said no more. Once Ma Shixiang left, the elder opened his eyes slowly. Something seemed to have sparked interest in those aged and calm eyes. Looking at the curtain, he gently said, "Isn't it rather surprising that a soldier from such a remote border town would make it to the academy? In any case, this lad must be top-notch in both character and competency, hence he should do well as our guide. I have only been abroad for 1 year. Never would I have thought the academy, sacred as it is, was going to accept vulgar soldiers of this kind." Even though sounding careless and unappreciative, her real attitude seemed to have changed somehow. This noble was no longer firmly against having Nink as their guide. The academy, a name that made this bigwig change her mind so easily, must undoubtedly be somewhere quite extraordinary. Then the elder changed the topic, looking slightly perplexed. As I went to see the calligraphy he had written on the floor, which was the 3rd chapter of the article on the response of the Tao, the linear structure was concise and extremely vivid at the same time. All that he had used was a tree branch on wet soil, and yet the strength of the calligraphy conveyed a sense of metallic sharpness on ceramic. This little soldier is definitely on the right path in the art of calligraphy, and I really wonder how he was trained, and who he learned it from. That soldier might have some minor and insignificant talent with the brush, and seeing it the first time was rather shocking, but thinking about it now, they were probably just clever but worthless tricks. He could probably end up selling his calligraphy outside the scent workshop in the capital, if he was lucky, replied the noble with indifference. The elder shook his head and said, novelty is probably the key to it. I'm not a master of calligraphy, but those strikes did convey a subtle sense of alchemy, which is a highly rare feature in calligraphy. It slightly resembles the unique methods of those talisman Taoism masters. You don't mean the divine talisman, do you? Startled, the noble replied mockingly. Out of the billions of people in the world, merely a dozen talisman Taoism masters exist, some of which reside in the imperial court, others in their abbeys, meditating and cultivating for a lifetime to achieve the ability to condense the breath of nature in alchemy strikes. That lad emitted no such air, being a mere mortal. Even if he studied the article on the response of the Tao for 50 more years, he would probably remain ordinary without a chance to have a glimpse into the initial stage, so there is no way he can ever compare to those masters. The elder smiled and said nothing. Despite being a cultivator and highly respected by the noble for his skills and seniority, there remained a pretty huge gap between their statuses. Therefore, he should say no more unless he wanted to risk offending her. Nevertheless, he disagreed with her about the young soldier. From the perspective of the elder, the chance of a mere mortal in this world of sensing the breath of nature and subsequently entering the initial stage was 1 in a million. The first step of being able to sense was extremely difficult if not impossible. Saying that, if Nink managed to study in the academy, and by a stroke of luck gained access to the legendary second floor to enter the world of cultivation eventually, his enigmatic and powerful style of calligraphy would surely be a precious gift. In the worst-case scenario, his calligraphy skills alone would inevitably earn him the appreciation of the sublime beings from the academy and the Taoist altar, or at least leave the scholars and calligraphers pretty shocked. Nink put down the book, shook his head, and made his way outside, while still looking slightly disappointed and reluctant. This tome of article on the response of the Tao was indeed as ordinary as the maidservant had pointed out, and he bought it at a bazaar in Caping as a child. He knew this very well, but never gave up reading and memorizing it incessantly, treasuring it as if it was the 7 tomes of arcane, enshrined at the unknowable place of Haitian Taoism. The corners of the book looked dilapidated and worn out from extensive reading, so much that it would have fallen apart completely had Sang Sang not carefully sewn it back together. Unfortunately, despite having read through every page, and memorized every phrase over and over again, it all felt in vain to him. He couldn't even perform the simplest act of sensing as the book depicted, let alone achieve what they called the initial stage of cultivation. There had been disappointment and even desperation, but he felt much more relieved upon finding out that the vast majority of ordinary people in this world are incapable of sensing the key of nature. Indeed, the legendary unworldly supreme beings were anything but normal, and only the very rare and abnormal ones were gifted enough to sense the key of nature. No wonder the night sky in Chang'an wasn't brimming with flying swords and supreme beings floating all over the place, despite the ubiquity of the article on the response of Tao. Nink considered himself to be pretty normal, or simply quite ordinary. Yet imagine having come across a massive mountain of treasure right in front of you, but having to leave empty-handed, or suddenly discovering that nature was replete with a wonderful invisible cloud-like substance called the primordial key, and not being able even to touch any of it. That would certainly leave a bitter taste in the mouth. The city of Wei is so impoverished, and the grassland barbarians have already been defeated by His Majesty the Emperor. They shall not dare cross the line for several years, meaning that I won't be able to get many medals anyway. So of course, it's great for me to go back to the capital. I'm certainly not bitter about it. In the dimly lit military camp, Nink bowed down to the general respectfully and sincerely as he went on to explain. I'm just thinking that there is still time till the date of registration at the academy, and I don't see the need to leave in such a rush. Over the past few years, as I have served under your command, I dare not say I made a drastic improvement, but your teaching has made me into someone worthy of respect, and I have even been lucky enough to be accepted by the academy. Truth be told, I would much rather spend more time in the city of Wei and stay by your side longer so that I can learn more from you, or simply sit and chat with you like this. Staring at the lad in front of him, the beard of the general started to drift slightly as a result of the night wind, or perhaps from pure frustration. Obviously annoyed, he sneered. Nink, you little brat, since when have you become so shameless?" Pulling a serious face, Nink replied, "I can rid myself of this face any time, as long as it can be of use to you, my general." "Now tell me the truth." With a cold and serious expression, Ma Shixiang asked, "Why are you unwilling to work for them as a guide?" After a long silence, Nink finally muttered, "General, the noble doesn't seem to like me at all." "The noble doesn't like you?" Ma Shixiang chided gravely. "Have you forgotten who you are? Do you understand that you are not a student of the academy yet, and as a soldier, you simply have to obey the order of your superior, which means to obey me? You are not entitled to worry about whether the noble likes you or not. And whether you like her or not, no one, absolutely no one, would care. You just need to obey and carry out your duty." Stubborn as he was, Nink stared down at the tiny grass, sprouting out from the soil in between his boots with similar determination, expressing his unwillingness through this silence. Ma Shixiang didn't know what to do with this lad anymore. He sighed. "Come on, tell me what is wrong with you. Why won't you just go back to the capital with them?" With a very serious face, Nink said, "I checked their people and carriages outside to find that they have obviously been under attack at the grassland. The grassland is undergoing spring drought right now, and the Golden Horde Chanao just died last year, and the maidservant of the noble had pretty tan skin. Considering all the above, I dare not go with them. The attack, the drought, the death of the Chanao, the tan skin of the maidservant, something about the sum of these apparently irrelevant facts was the precise reason why Nink adamantly refused to leave the city of Wei." "You figured it out then?" asked Ma Shixiang. "Everyone in the city of Wei should have figured out who they are by now." Looking at the other side of the military camp with a shrug, Nink said, "Perhaps a silly little princess who grew up in the courts of Chang'an, married off on the grassland, and didn't even realize when her husband died is the only one stupid enough to think that her big secret remains safe." Chapter 4. The simple view of right and wrong of the Tang. Though they discussed it privately in the military camp at midnight and in such an open empire, Ma Shixian couldn't help becoming anxious when hearing "stupid princess." He was so nervous and cautious with every action when the noble princess arrived in the city of Wei, and he never thought that Nink would have such a harsh and unreasonable comment about her, which made Ma Shixiang so displeased. Nobody would deem the princess as an idiot. Instead, they respected her as their highness with virtue. As a great country with a strong military force, the Tang would never adopt humiliating political measures like political marriages, no matter if the enemy was from the tribe of savages or other countries in the Central Plains. Nothing like that had ever occurred after the several marriages of the most loyal generals of the tribe of savages who served Taizu, the founder of the Tang Dynasty, with royal women. However, when the sovereignty of the grasslands started to be unstable 3 years ago, along with an invasion of the largest golden tribe to the Tang secret insight to enemies, the youngest princess of Tang, at the budding age of 13, kneeled in front of the Ming Palace and kowtowed for days and requested to marry the Chanao of Golden Tribe in exchange for peace in the whole country. The entire Tang was shocked when the announcement of this marriage of peace was issued. With bitter hatred, old officials kept requesting for the emperor to cancel the marriage. The emperor smashed countless jade cups angrily, and the queen left nothing but loads of complicated emotions. However, none of that could stop the princess's determination. Chanao felt so astonished after knowing all of those things and quite liked her true identity, and then ordered 5,000 lambs and cows as a tribute to the empire to marry the princess. In the end, the Tang emperor agreed with the peace marriage reluctantly. The couple cared for and respected each other in their marriage. The ambitious leader of the tribe of savages had become a calm lion in the grassland, defending his territory and keeping distance with the closest inch of the Tang. However, beyond everyone's expectation, the young Chanao died without any warning, and his younger brother succeeded the position against objection. All of this just made the political situations tense again. Regardless, for quite a long time, 4 to 5 years, since the young princess decided to marry Chanao, the northwestern border of the Tang was in a precious peaceful situation. There was a rumor saying that the most likely reason why the princess insisted on marrying far away was to get out of the queen's control. However, even if that was true, what the princess did, in the perception of major military and court officials, was the wise and right thing to do. She could have chosen an easier way, but in the end, she walked on the roughest path. But to the generals who had experienced countless wars, like Ma Shixiang, they would never have felt afraid of any war and those barbarians. That's why the princess's marriage of peace made them extremely shamed. However, no one would reject the gift of peace. In this case, they developed complicated feelings about the princess, not only an unreasonable anger but also gratitude. As time went on, such mixed feelings had turned to respect from deep inside. Being an ordinary soldier, Ning could hardly understand such complicated feelings. Even if he could, he would not care to, because there was nothing that could be more important than his own safety, and what he was striving for currently was exactly related to that. Therefore, he continued with pretending that he didn't notice the general's concern. I have roughly estimated the number of arrow holes on the horse carriages. The new Chanai was pretty tough to deal with. Half of the guard might already have been killed so far. It's said there was a horse gang. Ma Shixiang seemed a bit unconfident in what he was saying. The truth was that he did not believe what he said. Even the Golden Chanai wouldn't attack our Tang princess brazenly, so it must be a horse gang, but everyone knows what the face is like under the mask. Ning continued. But the thing is, if the horse gang indeed was Chanai's people, why was that barbarian so bold to defend? They seemed fearless of being eliminated by the Tang, which sounds so unreasonable. The Tang was established with the foundation of military force. The culture here is simple while aggressive, being known as the most powerful country in the world. Nevertheless, even with such strength, it would still exhaust half of its strength to destroy the golden tribe of savages on the grassland. It sounded unreasonable to get involved in such turmoil just for rescuing a married princess. However, in fact, such things happened many times before in the Tang's history. One of the most famous examples happened during the old age of Taizu, the founder of the Tang Dynasty. At that time, a tribe massacred a village positioned along Baiyang Road. 140 residents there were all killed without mercy. The emperor sent a messenger to ask what happened. However, one of his ears was cut off and he was expelled by the Chanai. Taizu felt so angry and immediately decided to invade the grassland, leading a military group of 80,000 cavalries. After hearing this, the tribe escaped to the northern wilderness against strong wind and snow, while the Tang's group kept chasing them, until several months later when the tribe was finally slaughtered. Fighting for several months, destroying all the enemies. The Tang earned that at a terrible cost. To make sure there were sufficient supplies for such an exhausting war, the imperial court sent millions of farmers to the battlefield and collected all of the livestock. Fields around Min Mountain was all left uncultivated, the tax in the south quadrupled, and officials had no spare time to take care of those things. The whole country was on the edge of turmoil, even collapse. The Tang's most fabulous quality was observed during such a dangerous period, as well as in subsequent years while appraising this matter. When the imperial marching onto the wilderness, the rebels in the south didn't attack the military. Instead, they returned to bases and seemed like they were standing at the side of the imperial. Perhaps not every rebel did it for the so-called national righteousness. Some of them might have also wanted to utilize this opportunity to win the fight, but they had to face the reality that the poor peasants who supported them, and heads and soldiers in the troop, were all strongly against them to do so. Taizu didn't earn a high historical status due to this battle, even inside the empire. No matter if in history books, or in stories from storytellers, you could see or hear no good comments about him, but instead, totalitarian and harsh. However, even though the most pedantic scholars, the professors who didn't care about the sovereignty, or the farmers and businessmen who badly hate tax might all criticize Taizu for various reasons, none of them would deny the necessity of the war. All the Tang's people always firmly believed in a simple principle from the establishment of their country: I won't invade anyone, and nobody can invade me either. Even if I invade you, you're still not allowed to invade me back. An eye for an eye. That's what we established as the baseline. That's what made Tang stronger and more powerful. And that's why Tang was recognized as the strongest country in the world. Chapter 5. The future discussion of an unrepresented Tang. The Tang Empire was regarded as the most powerful country in the world for a simple but strong reason. Nink was not an indigenous person to Tang. He was not brave enough to fight to the death on the battlefield or humorous enough to set fire to his own house just for fun. Even if he were given another 20 years to live in the city of Wei, he would not have a dramatic life and rise to a general from a beggar. However, he had been in the army long enough that he understood the strengths and weaknesses of the Tangs in this period. As soon as he found the arrow holes in the princess's carriages, he inferred some troubling issues. If the successive Chanai was so bold as to try and assassinate the Princess of Tang regardless of laws, he was either insane or he had gotten some promises from some actual powerful guys in the court of the empire that he would not face retaliation. The Princess Li Yu has already entered the city of Wei in Tang, but she still hasn't told anyone who she is. Why? Possibly, she doesn't trust anyone or she would like to confide in His Majesty. But she never trusts anyone in the court, including you, soldiers like us or the entire imperial court. Because she knows that the grassland barbarians must get some sort of permission from someone in Chang'an to assassinate her. Moreover, the people who could be trusted in Chang'an could give that type of permission to barbarians numbered less than 4, all of whom she doesn't want to mess with. For this kind of war among the courts, even you, a general, would have to stay away, let alone an ordinary person like me. Ning crushed the wet mud with his heels and whispered. There must have been a lot of trouble during the trip, and even if I take down 3 or 5 enemies, I still won't be able to change the situation. So, if I join them, there will be one more dead body on the mountain. If I don't, there will be one more honest soldier in the city of Wei. General, please treat me as if I were the Wei-stayer in nature and don't count on me. Ma Shixiang looked at the seemingly humble young people and said, you should call yourself a fart if you really want me to withdraw the order. Ning smiled and answered. I'm going to be a student at the academy and certainly, it's better to talk elegantly. Ma Shixiang did not continue to tease the young man. He frowned and then explained to him. Recommending you to be the guide for the princess has something to do with the academy actually. You have gotten enough military deeds and passed your first exam. I also asked my superior to write a recommendation for you and a confirmation was received from the military ministry. But, do you really think those are enough to get you into the academy? You've been staying in the city of Wei Frontier Fortress all of these years and I'm sure you have heard some legends about the academy, but still you have no understanding of that place. The general was very dignified and serious. In our opinion, the academy is the most sacred and inviolable place. The confirmation from the military ministry only means you can take the entrance exam for the academy. But, you have to collect stamps from at least 3 departments before you can join the academy. The department won't likely take the recommendation written by low-ranked generals like us seriously. Even the confirmation from the military ministry isn't enough. They could easily delay you taking your exam for several years. Your situation has become pretty common in these past few years. Except for the students that are admitted by the teachers of the academy, any student recommended by the imperial departments has to buy their way into the academy and this would cost all of their family's resources. I know you have some money saved here, but, do you really think that just a few hundred silver will satisfy these guys? Ning scratched his head and sighed. No one told me about that. There's no need to tell you because there is a solution. Ma Shixiang looked at him and said forcefully, if you can make a contribution during this trip and impress the princess, even if she can only remember your name or she can request that some steward intercedes for you in Chang'an, no one would dare to blackmail you after that. That means, I have to gamble with my life to receive a qualification for an academy entry exam. That seems unfair. Ning said. Ma Shixiang stared at him fiercely and said, imbecile. Many people are willing to sell their mother or kill their father just to get into the academy and yet, you are going to just quit because of a little risk? After a while, the general had calmed down and he said, according to my analysis, the princess also knows that she can't cover her tracks. So, if you can figure out who she is, all of the people in the city of Wei can as well. How come her enemies haven't figured her out? Since she insisted on continuing the trip, there must be some reinforcements not far away. Your mission is to guide her through the mountains and help her get in touch with those reinforcements as soon as possible. How can you call that gambling? Ning lowered his head and tried to figure out the pros and cons of this. Ma Shixiang looked at him and thought about his odd temper, which annoyed most people. He knew it would be hard to convince Nink without there being any profit. He sighed and whispered, "An old man is going with the princess, whose first name is LV. And it is said that he practiced in the South School of Haitian Taoism." Hearing this, Nink suddenly looked up and immediately his eyes lit up. Ma Shixiang said, "You arrived here when you were a little kid and played with everyone in the city, charming them with your sweet mouth and your abilities. You were always the most popular kid in the city, even with the soldiers who came and went or the bosses of that meat pie restaurant that had changed twice." He touched Nink's head as if he were a spoiled boy and said, "The former general got you a military status before he died. You saved us when we went to the grassland to kill the horse gang and almost got killed by the barbarians that autumn. Thanks to you, we came back alive. Everyone here has decided to reward to you, and we already collected money to buy you a night with the most popular prostitute in the capital, if you want." The grey-haired general changed the subject and said, "But no one had expected that you wanted to learn magic stuff. Unfortunately, we couldn't find you a teacher to help you, and we just let you read the article on the response of the Tao over and over. Now is your chance." Ma Shixiang suddenly became serious. "The academy, as well as the old man named LV, you have to catch them both." Nink kept silence for a long time and then sighed. "I just don't want to leave here." The moonlight was very soft and peaceful outside the window. Ma Shixiang looked at the young man and said, "The city of Wei is still too small, and you should go to the capital Chang'an and see the real world. Maybe there will be some monsters, but none of them should scare you away. At least, out there won't be only one article on the response of the Tao." Chapter 6. The night without a moon, a time of yearning. A ditch, no wider than a stream, lay to the south of the city of Wei, and beside the ditch rose a small slope that couldn't even be regarded as more than a tiny hill. A hut, without a functioning fence or a slate roof, was found at the foot of the slope, which was not even qualified to be called a house. The rain clouds had dispersed earlier, allowing bright stars to shed light over the ditch, the slope, and the hut, forming a beautiful silver glow. Under the starlight, Nink jogged ahead, but he was dragging his feet. He slowed his pace to take a longer look at the hut where he and Sang Sang had spent most of their time together. But, no matter how slow he walked, his destination would always be reached because he kept moving forward. The pathetic fence, which was only capable of warding off dogs, was pushed open. He walked towards the dazzling light of the oil lamp streaming through the crack in the door. Covering his mouth, he coughed several times to announce his presence and said, "How about we move to the capital?" The door was pushed open, with a squeak, breaking the silence of the night. The little handmaiden Sang Sang kneeled beside the door, the shadow of her thin body elongated by the lamplight. She pressed her figure against the wooden frame and responded, "Haven't you always had a longing for Chang'an? Well, I need something. When will you be able to steal some oil from the firearm camp? This door has been creaking for several months and it is bothersome. Who still uses those hard-to-use firearms? If you just want oil, I will ask for some from the baggage camp tomorrow." Nink answered her randomly by instinct, and suddenly something came to his mind. "Wait. This isn't the conversation I intended to have with you. If we are really leaving, why are we still bothering with this useless door?" Sang Sang bent onto her knees. Her small figure looked extremely thin with the cool night breeze of spring blowing against her. She stared at Nink and uttered the following words softly, careful not to show any emotion. "If we leave, there are going to be others residing here. They would still need to use the door. Are there really others who would want to spend their lives in this remote and broken hut, other than us?" Nink thought silently, with a sudden feeling of unwillingness somehow striking him. He sighed softly and squeezed past Sang Sang, murmuring, "Take the night to pack up our luggage." Sang Sang randomly combed her fingers through her hair at her temples. Looking at his back, she asked, "Nink, I can't understand why you are so crazy about it. Nobody could reject the temptation of growing stronger, and moreover, it is really attractive." Nink realized that his little handmaiden had figured out what he was thinking. He raised his head to see her little swan-like face. Tilting his eyebrows, he continued, Anyway, we can't spend our entire life in the city of Wei. The world is big and just waiting for us to explore. Besides the Tang Empire, there are many other countries. In addition, in regard to making more money or getting a quicker promotion, Chang'an is more of an ideal place to live compared to the city of Wei. That's why I must gain admittance and join the academy. Sang Sang appeared to be immersed in her thoughts. She was not fully grown and her age was considered young. However, the sandstorms in the fortress had blown against her face, darkening and roughing her skin. Her yellowish hair was a result of childhood malnutrition. All of these things contributed to her less than beautiful, toughened face. But she had a pair of eyes as thin as willow leaves, as blue as crystal ice, and they seldom showed a special expression, all of which endowed her with the appearance of a mature and sophisticated lady rather than a young maid, no older than 12, who had been born from bitterness. The extreme contrast of her true age and her wry expressions made others feel she had a cool style. While in Ning's eyes, these were all fake illusions. He was well aware that Sang Sang typically belonged to that kind of thoughtless girl. During this long time of sticking it out together, she had become accustomed to following his words and her laziness in thinking hence grew, which accordingly led to her slow-mindedness. Therefore, to cover her slow-mindedness she had begun to speak fewer words, making her appear even weirder. No, she is not slow-minded, she is just clumsy. He corrected himself in his mind as he thought of something. After a long silence, Sang Sang suddenly raised her head and bit her lip, wearing a look of timidity that was rarely seen. She uttered, "I've heard. Chang'an is rather big and has many people. The capital is prosperous. It is said the population there has already exceeded 1 million since the third year of Qianqi, and of course, the cost of living there is rather high. Anyway, it won't be an easy task." Ning sighed as he got a glimpse of the girl's nervousness. He then comforted her. "Nothing to be scared of, just take it as a bigger version of the city of Wei. I will be responsible for external affairs and you stay inside to deal with the chores, just as we have always done. If you still feel uneasy, then we can just reduce the amount of time you spend going out. How much will it cost for daily necessities for 1 month?" Her willow leaf-like eyes gazed in surprise, clenching the lower hem of her skirt as she queried nervously, "Will it exceed 4 taels of silver? That will be 2 times higher than the cost is here. If I'm really to enroll in the academy, you'd better make me some good clothes, because there will be visitors like my classmates coming to visit us. Moreover, some masters may also come to visit my family, in the case that they appreciate me, your young master. I've figured it out roughly, it will cost us no less than 10 silver taels." Ning answered with his eyebrows furrowed, but actually, he was just spouting out nonsense in a careful way, for he was unaware that, in the eyes of the academy disciples, that amount of money could only buy a not-so-good dinner in Xiangxiang restaurant. As the famous joke went, in the country women's imagination, the empress is always baking meat pies as big as an ocean and the imperial concubines peeling onions as high as a mountain. However, even though it was actually less cruel than the reality, that answer had far exceeded the bottom line for the little maid. She stared at him, frowning, and suggested, "That's too expensive. Ning, how about we don't leave and give up on the academy? You're so ignorant." Ning scolded, "I will most certainly be an official after graduating from the academy. You and I will need 10 taels of silver each month, but I can earn at least 70 or 80 from the local government. Moreover, what's the matter with Chang'an? They have a variety of cosmetics which can be found in the Qingjinji cosmetics store." Clearly, the little handmaiden sank in a fiercely mental struggle as if she was stricken by the word cosmetics. After a while, she lightly bit her lip and gave an answer in a pig's whisper. "What about the years you will spend studying in the academy? My needlework can't compete with the ones in Chang'an. How will we support ourselves? That is indeed a concern, and what's more, hunting is prohibited around Chang'an, because the forests there can only be utilized by the emperor. How much money do we have now?" Circumflex. The two of them exchanged meaningful looks with their eyes and went over to the 2 large elmwood boxes in agreement. They opened up one of them, fumbled around and pulled out a tightly packaged wooden case from deep within. There were small pieces of silver in the wooden box, with only one big piece in the middle. Clearly, these were their day-to-day savings, and only a small amount. Neither of them moved to count the pieces, and then in a soft voice, Sang Sang said, "As usual, I counted them every 5 days, and the latest one was done the night before last. The total is 76 taels and 34 cents. It seems that we should be able to manage to make more money in Chang'an." Nink replied earnestly. "And I will strive to improve my needlework a bit." Sang Sang also replied thoughtfully. When night fell, Sang Sang was kneeling to make Ning's bed. Her skinny knees moved quickly and nimbly. She then pushed her little palm against his pillow to make an arc in the middle, so Nink could enjoy a comfortable sleep. She held up her quilts and leaped off the bed, and then she walked towards the 2 elmwood boxes in the corner to make her own. Putting out the light, Nink put a bowl of water on the windowsill and got into bed by starlight. He put his hands on the edge of the quilt and made a big comfortable yawn. A familiar rustling from the corner of the room came to his ears several minutes after he closed his eyes. This night appeared to be no different from any other night where they would fall soundly asleep under the starlight in this fortress city. However, they both suffered from sleeplessness this night. The excitement of arriving in a new world, seeing the prosperity of Chang'an, all of the honor and wealth at hand, or even the fascinating style of makeup, had greatly stirred the two of them. Their breathing was far from placid this time. After laying there for a while, Nink opened his eyes and stared blankly at the faint silver glow before saying, "I've heard, girls in Chang'an are not scared of the cold. They wear thin clothes with wide-open collars and have fair complexions. I'm not sure if it is true or not. I was too young to remember." He then turned over onto his other side, looking toward the dark corner and asked, "Sang Sang, how is your illness these days? Do you still feel cold?" It seemed that the little handmaiden shook her head no in the darkness. Through the faint light, he caught sight of her and saw that she was grabbing her quilt while keeping her eyes tightly closed, though her mouth wore a hint of a rare smile. She muttered, "Of course they are fair, nobody would be tan after putting on such good makeup." Nink grinned and then answered, "Take it easy and you can buy anything you like from the Chinjinji cosmetics store after I, your young master, make a fortune." Suddenly Sang Sang opened her long and thin eyes. He could see the bright starlight reflected in them. Seriously, she asked, "Nink, you promise?" "I told you, call me young master in Chang'an. That's the way to show respect." 7 or 8 years had passed since Nink had dug the icy cold Sang Sang out from under a pile of corpses beside the road and struggled to get to the city of Wei. Although Sang Sang was registered as a maidservant in the census and did work as a maidservant, she never called Nink young master. This was just her habit. There was no other special reason. And today, she was compelled to give up this habit. "Nink, young master, remember that you've promised to buy me cosmetics from the Chinjinji cosmetics store?" Nink nodded as his sight fell on the frost-white starlight that illuminated the ground beside his bed. Somehow this made his heart tighten a bit, and the feeling of emptiness from many years ago came back to attack him again. He looked back at the dark sky outside the window, glancing at the stars, and was then immersed in nostalgia. He muttered, "Still a night without a moon." Lying on the elmwood boxes in the corner, Sang Sang was curled up in her cool quilt like a small mouse. She stretched out her hand to pull the quilt behind her waist to keep out the chilly air, which somewhat alleviated the uncomfortableness brought on by the gap between the 2 elmwood boxes. Hearing his dreamlike words, she figured, "Nink, young master is beginning to utter this nonsense again." Chapter 7. Off to be outstanding in Chang'an early the next morning, Nink and Sang Sang woke up and then began to pack in morning twilight. They had a few disputes, but they mostly kept silent. Nink pulled out a long bag that had been hidden under the mud wall outside, and took a bow and some arrows out of it. He checked them carefully and then handed them over once he had ensured that they were fine. Sang Sang took them and put them into a big bag made of cotton. She then took out 3 sheathed straight knives, covered with rust, out from under the fence. Nink took them from her and carefully scrubbed at the rust and looked at the edge of the knives while facing the sun. He then nodded and tied them with a straw rope to his back. He took out a black umbrella from behind the door and tied it on Sang Sang's back with the rest of the straw rope. This black umbrella was made from an unknown material and looked as if there was some sort of black oil on it that absorbed light, and it appeared a little heavy. It looked large before it was fastened to Sang Sang's thin and small body, but once it was attached it almost touched the ground. After preparing for the journey, Nink and Sang Sang climbed over the shabby fence in tandem. They looked back at the small bluestone road and the tiny rundown hut at the same time. Looking up at Nink's jaw, Sang Sang asked, "Young master, do we need to lock the door?" "No." Nink went silent for a while and said, "Evermore, maybe we hardly come back." The wooden wheel, covered by iron, rolled over the wet and soft ground. The noble's convoy set out slowly. They were going to the outside of the city of Wei. 5 carriages, from the front to the rear, attracted a lot of attention on the frontier. Today, there were many people lined along the road to say farewell. However, their focus was not on the noble's carriage, but on the young man and handmaiden sitting in the first horse carriage. Boiled eggs were given to them from time to time, and some aunt, with black and red cheeks, said something and cried while clutching a dirty handkerchief. "Wicked Nink, you are so bad. My distant nephew is a fine man, yet you won't allow Sang Sang to marry him. Now you are taking her to those horrifying places with you. You listen carefully. You must take good care of my Sang Sang." Sitting on the shaft, Nink looked awkward as he answered, "Aunt, you have been asking Sang Sang to get married since she was just 8, how could I let this happen?" It began to rain and some of the people complained and made jokes. The slight drizzle lightly sprinkled on the line of people and it was a little cold. But no one left, including the relatives of the soldiers of the city of Wei who were busy seeing Nink off or settling debts with him. The crowd was very boisterous. In the rear of the group, the most exquisite carriage's curtain opened a little, and that proud and indifferent maidservant popped her head out to look around. She couldn't help but knit her brows. When the carriages were ready to leave this border town, Nink stood up on the carriage and then saluted to the crowd. Carrying the 3 old swords on his back, the lad saluted with bare hands in the rain. This scene made him feel a little brave and grand. "Everyone, menfolk, children, sisters, and aunts, I don't have many words to express my gratitude." After saying this, he opened his arms wide and clenched his fists in the rain, showing his chest muscles and his arms which were not very strong. He posed stupidly like this and shouted, "This time I will go to Chang'an City, and if I don't become someone, I will never come back." His words were just like the platform from which a storytelling man used to start his talk, or like in Egypt when a bloody head fell to the ground. The crowd cheered for him along the way. In the only decent tavern in the city of Wei, Ma Shixiang and some of his trusted military officers were drinking. The noble had told them not to see them off and they didn't want to send the young man off either. However, they saw the scene clearly. One of the officers thought about what Nink had said when he stood on the carriage and he could not help but sigh. If he doesn't become something, he won't come back, will he? It seems that the unsuccessful lad really won't come back. Ma Shixiang sat at the wine table and thought about the 3 sentences Nink had said to him last night. He could not help but touch his beard and said happily with comfort at seeing that carriage leaving out the gate of the city slowly, "It's better not to come back, you jerk. Make trouble for the outside world." They were far from the city of Wei and well into the grasslands. The spring drought that had troubled the tribe of savages and the new Chanai did not make an impact here. The spring wind had made the leaves and grass green. They were crushed by wheels and trampled by the horses' hooves while some butterflies chased each other endlessly. The steeds ran through the grasslands towards hills and the soft ropes between the horses and the carriages tensed tight as iron or dropped loose as a leaf. The luxury carriage was covered with some cotton quilts and blankets which billowed gently as the horses ran. The comely maidservant stared at the scene outside, flying past the window. Her face was a little stiff while she thought about the desolate northern part, her eyes were full of expectations of the unknown future. There was a boy, wearing luxurious fur clothing, hugging his legs, inside the carriage. He lifted his head from his knees and mumbled some Central Plains words, asking if he could go outside to play for a while. The maidservant turned around and rebuked the boy strictly, but she quickly softened again. She took him in her arm and hugged him while she rubbed his head favorably. The wind lifted one corner of the curtain and the spring wind touched her face. However, it was not as delicate as before. The maidservant squinted to the front of the convoy with a scowl. At the front of the line, there was the young soldier named Nink who was sitting on the shaft of the simple carriage. His head hung as if he were falling asleep. As a guide, he should have been actively guiding the group, but instead, he slept most of the time. He was far from being a qualified guide. Even so, that was not the reason the maidservant scowled, it was something else. Nink fell asleep on the shaft and looked as if he could fall down from the speeding carriage at any time. So, the small handmaiden Sang Sang kept guard and watched him alertly. She supported him with her thin and small body, and while her expression could not be seen clearly on her dark face, her pain could be felt. Suddenly, the carriage bounced over a very shallow stream and woke Nink. He rubbed his eyes and accessed the time of day. It was dusk now, so he raised his arm and beckoned the group to stop and camp. No one protested his decision even though he had just woken up. Every decision the young man made had proven to be right ever since they had left the city of Wei. Over the last few days, this included path selection, campsites, safety defense, water and food, and possible ways for evacuation. He had yet to make a wrong decision, and the group was moving quite fast under his leadership. Several barbarians, which reigned in grasslands, initially looked down on the border soldiers of Wei, but now they just admired the young soldier as a guide. Along the stream, people dug and leveled the ground, collected firewood and boiled water in silence. The maidservant got out of the protected carriage and found Nink lying on the grass comfortably while enjoying some boiled meat. Her frown deepened when she found the thin, black handmaiden getting water. She lifted the pot and collected firewood. Upon seeing her step out, a strong guard stood up. She shook her head to prevent him from following her, and she walked along the stream through the fire smoke. She had to admit that Nink's guidance was not bad, but much better than the young men in capital city Chang'an. If he were a nobleman in Chang'an, maybe she would admire his attitude. However, he was just a poor underclassman, and he bullied the small girl who should share woe and happiness with him. This made the maidservant unhappy, and it invaded her thoughts. Walking over to Sang Sang, the maidservant smiled at her gently and gave her a sign to put down the heavy firewood so she could talk to her. Sang Sang walked toward her until Nink nodded to her when she saw him. The maidservant took out a handkerchief from her waist to pass it to Sang Sang, but Sang Sang shook her head. Even though she had done a lot of work, there was no sweat to be wiped away. At this point, Nink finally stood up from the meadow. He dusted the grass off his body, wiping green grass juice on his coat, and made a salute to the maidservant. The maidservant didn't even turn her head and said coldly, "I don't like you, so you can save your ingratiation. People like you look young and gentle, but in fact, you are rotten to your core, and I find it disgusting." Saying this without emotion, she lifted her jaw and expressed her noble character even though she did not intend to keep distant. As a maidservant of the Princess of Tang, she could give orders to most of the officials in the country, including Nink. Nink shook his head while smiling and then turned to the mud stove near the stream. He only had the one small handmaiden while the noble had numerous maidservants. His only handmaiden was taken to chat, for fun, by one of the maidservants, and the noble still had other servants to serve her while he was left to feed himself. Maybe the sand and wind had thickened his face, but there was no awkwardness on his face at all. Sang Sang came back with a pile of cheese at sunset, while Nink was staring painfully at his burnt meat porridge. Seeing the snacks, he took them from her and gobbled them up. "Why does she like to talk with you so much? She doesn't even consider me and the fact I have not had a good meal for several days." The cheap sympathy of a noble was given in the wrong place. Her smile is like a grandmother wolf who wants to eat small girls. She thinks she's decent and warm, but she is faker than the people who sell artificial wine at the tavern in the city of Wei. She is a good person. Sang Sang picked up the bowl of burnt porridge besides him, intending to make a new one, but she was stopped by him. "What do you talk about these days?" asked Nink. Sang Sang furrowed her brows and tried to recall what had been said. Then she answered, "You know I don't enjoy talking," and she was talking about what had happened in the grasslands, most of the time. I don't remember much of what she said actually. Upon hearing this, Nink immediately felt happier. He hummed a tune while he chewed on the delicious cheese and said, "If she wants to talk to you again, remember to tell her to pay you or let you bring back more cheese." Soon night fell. After the water was heated, Sang Sang extinguished the fire with water from the brook and then walked to the small tent with the bucket of hot water. People near the stream were familiar with this, as the small handmaiden was often seen preparing water for Nink to wash his feet with, and they exuded disdain on their faces. Of course, their disdain was for Nink. After washing his feet, Nink slid into the wool comforter, and then hugged the small cold feet of Sang Sang's in his arms. He groaned, but one couldn't tell if it was from pain or enjoyment. After yawning twice, he said, "Good night." Sang Sang was more exhausted than Nink, so she had sunk into a deep sleep before long. Startled, Nink opened his eyes and looked up at the sky through the tent. It had patches, and it took him a moment to focus on a particular handkerchief. He knew he was right when he saw the golden-edged handkerchief clutched in the maidservant hands. But he just didn't know what he was right about. Chapter 8. Drinking at night, dreaming of the ocean staring at the ceiling of the tent, in his mind, Nink went through all the details and traces since they left City of Wei. The curtain of the extravagant horse carriage stayed firmly closed throughout the time, while the little boy with obvious barbarian features would occasionally leave the carriage to play. The princess had seldom appeared. The pretty but arrogant maidservant was the one giving orders. Strangely, that maidservant seemed to enjoy chatting with Sang Sang. And even more strangely, she never bothered to conceal her contempt towards him. Nink considered her to be an excellent actress. Back in City of Wei and throughout the journey, nothing out of the attitude of the grassland men or her own manners and behaviors suggested that she wasn't a real maidservant. That was precisely what baffled him, since he never imagined anyone from the real nobility of Tang Empire should care about sympathizing with Sang Sang. Nevertheless, this wasn't something that really mattered to him. Over the past few days, he had been keeping a close eye on the elderly man. If he guessed right, this kind-looking elder should be a sublime being from the South School of Haitian Taoism, the one mentioned earlier by General Ma. Since a very young age, Nink had been determined to gain access to that enigmatic world at no avail. The presence of a true cultivator was the real reason why he agreed to travel with this group to the capital. Unfortunately, he was given no chance to speak to the well-protected elder. Only occasionally when they stopped to eat, his gaze met that of the elder, and he could swear he felt a sense of kindness or even encouragement from the look in the eyes of the elder. This again left him rather perplexed. Failing to reach a conclusion, Nink stopped thinking and realized the pair of little feet he held on his chest simply refused to warm up and stayed cold like ice, making his chest and abdomen feel just as cold. He frowned with concern. Sang Sang, the little handmaiden, went through a lot of hardship as a baby, surviving in cold wind and rain among a pile of rotting corpses. She fell critically ill after Nink found her, and didn't recover for months. She had been looked at by military doctors at Wei, and he even took her to the faraway Caping, and all the doctors shared the same opinion: prenatal insufficiency of weak and cold nature. Due to her fragile and cold-prone body, Sang Sang hardly ever sweated, and consequently, she was unable to expel all the harmful toxins her body produced daily. Over time and accumulation of the toxins, she became even weaker. That was why Nink followed the doctor's advice and made sure that she endured a huge amount of physical exercise on a day-to-day basis to improve her circulation, and that was the real reason why in the eyes of others, he constantly made his skinny, dark-skinned little handmaid work like a slave. Nevertheless, despite copious physical exercise, Sang Sang could not necessarily warm up her body, and it felt freezing cold right now on the wool blanket. Rubbing his freezing tummy, Nink decided to get up and take out the liquor sack made of cowhide as he woke up Sang Sang and handed over the sack to her lips. Half asleep, Sang Sang opened her eyes and grabbed the sack without hesitation. She unscrewed the lid and poured the liquid down without leaking a drop of it. The tent was immediately filled with the strong and spicy scent of the typical hardcore grassland liquor. The tiny handmaiden held the large sack and gulped down the liquid as if it was water. In no time she managed to finish almost half a sack of liquor, of which 2 bowlfuls could easily leave a strong adult man unconscious. She didn't stop until her stomach started to bulge out. It looked rather valiant, if not utterly bizarre. She then wiped her lips, and her long, willow leaf-shaped eyes became even brighter in the darkness of the night, and one would not have guessed that she had been drinking. After smiling at Nink, she fell back and slept off again. The fragrance of liquor reminisced in the room, and the cold little feet he held on his chest gradually warmed up. Nink was finally relieved to see a few droplets of sweat emerging from the tip of her nose, and at last, he remembered to wipe off his own sweat from his forehead. Cuddling the wool blanket tightly, he slowly closed his eyes. Not far from his face rested the worn-out booklet of article on the response of the Tao. He would normally read or recite from memory a few pages every night before going to sleep. It was a habit he stuck with over the years. Shall all living creatures cultivate in aging and death, so that thy lives shall not be harmed by any evil? Shall all living creatures suffer from no aging nor ailment, prosper in longevity, and gain wisdom with fierce courage? As he gradually fell asleep, his mind and spirit began working alongside the seemingly simple yet deeply abstract and enigmatic words on the pages. As time went by, the wool blanket that covered Nink and Sang Sang seemed to have disappeared, as did the little tent, the grass outside, and the little stream evaporated into a cluster of fog and vanished, too. The whole world became an abstract realm where he became the world, and the world became him. In this realm, one could almost feel a subtle sound of breathing in an enigmatic rhythm, and the breath of nature slowly abounded into a vast ocean of warmth. Nink was not unfamiliar with the sensation. In fact, he was often able to sense it ever since he read the article many years ago. But at the same time, he was clearly aware of the sad fact that it was not a genuine form of sensing upon meditation, but merely a dream. The vast warm ocean was probably an illusion of the dream, since the tightly wrapped little feet he was holding finally started to warm up. At least it was a wonderful illusion after all. While consoling himself, Nink fell soundly asleep throughout the night. Waking up the next morning, Nink slept really well, even though he looked utterly surprised and upset, as if he craved to sleep for another 3 days. Robert White changed the route at such short notice. Looking at the poker-faced maidservant, he contained his temper and as gentle as possible he explained. We will go through Min Mountain to go straight to Huaxi Path. There will be no problem with this route I have chosen. No one in the tent showed any response to his concern, not even the maidservant. I'm the guide, and none of you are familiar enough with the Min Mountain. Nink looked at the maidservant again and after a brief silence went on to say, I understand you are worried about being ambushed. I can assure you that no one can stop you if you listen to me. The maidservant glanced at him as if he was insignificant, almost like saying, who gave you the right to request any sort of explanation from me? As he returned to his tent, Sang Sang was packing their belongings. He told her, we shall part from them soon as we send them off the main path. Looking at the simple map he drew years ago, he pointed at a place and said, this is the furthest we will go, because if we went further in, we could all be annihilated if the enemy sent a few cavalries our way. You should go and convince them, said Sang Sang looking at him. I guess the princess is expecting reinforcements once they get there. Therefore they won't listen to me, replied Nink. It's not my strong suit to convince a bunch of idiots. Sang Sang said nothing but looked at him inquisitively. If there will be reinforcements, what is worrying you so much that you have even decided to run off halfway? My gut feeling tells me that something is not right. Because I'm confident that a tough character who dares to plot the assassination of 4th Princess of Great Tang shouldn't be as stupid as that woman, and I bet there will be a few backup plans, replied Nink. Sang Sang hesitated but went on to remind him. You should respect her a little. I already know her real identity, said Nink with a raised eyebrow and mocking tone. She is the princess and so what? I said it back in the city of Wei, and I insist, she really is a stupid princess. Chapter 9. An arrow shot from the south of the northern mountain road. It's also essential to choose a suitable connecting spot for the people migrating. If I could choose, I would like a wider road than Pinecone Ridge. As he looked at the bold ink spots marked on the hand-drawing map, Nink said, they choose the northern mountain road without considering it was a one-way road with thick forests on both sides. It is the perfect place for an ambush. After saying this, he grew silent. He then put the map into his pocket, shook his head, and said in self-mockery, apparently, besides leading them into Northern Mountain Road, the guide has to confuse the enemy. The foolish princess has never believed in General Ma, and she would not trust me, either. An idiot is leading a bunch of idiots. Considering the possibility of troops arriving and being ambushed on Northern Mountain Road, Nink felt more and more depressed. He murmured angrily, "She has been in the grassland for nearly a year and hasn't learned. How did she earn her reputation?" Nink unsheathed the 3 swords caked with rust and watered the wet stone from his flask. He began the age-old ritual of sharpening the swords in preparation for the bloody battles awaiting them on Northern Mountain Road. It was, perhaps, a futile gesture, but at the very least, it calmed him down. "If we have to flee upon entering Northern Mountain Road, how would you ask the elderly man your questions?" Sang Sang asked dejectedly. "Life is the most important thing." Nink dropped his head while sharpening the swords and said, "If we can make it to Chang'an, then there's always a chance to learn. On the contrary, if we die because of these idiots, there will be no possibilities at all." It was warmer when traveling to the south. Normally, the picturesque landscapes out of the carriage window were coming to life and green. But as the troops marched higher up Min Mountain, the wavy green grassland around them disappeared, giving way to the tall trees that began to loom over them from the sides of the road. Their leaves were not quite green, yet looked like winter's end. As the temperature fell, an anxious and depressive air enveloped the troops. Everybody understood that taking her down at Min Mountain between the frontier fortress and counties would be the last chance for the bigwigs in Chang'an City to intercept the princess and get back to the capital safely. The troops marched with determination and caution for several days and finally arrived at the periphery of Northern Mountain Road. The sight of the deep forest was a relief to many of the weary travelers, but Nink was worried. Staying in the second carriage most of the time, the comely maidservant did not find the opportunity to visit Sang Sang as she did so often before. But on this day, she wore a smile when getting off the carriage at dusk. She had dispatched an emissary to the imperial precincts before leaving the grassland. Even though the troops would not shortly be arriving at Chang'an, and the emperor would not order the army to take her back so soon, the emissary had sufficient time to contact a subordinate loyal to her. She didn't hesitate to march into Northern Mountain Road once she received the urgent receipt from the Gushan commandery 10 days ago. She believed in Hua Shanai, the young senior captain who would be approaching Northern Mountain Road's southern entryway. Though she had left Tang a year ago, she still firmly believed those loyal before would be loyal to her again. Granted that some people had become the flunkies of that woman in the palace, she still trusted Hua Shanai, because the way he looked at her was so tender. At sunset, the troops stopped and set up camp 15 kilometers away from the appointed location. No matter what, passing through the thick forest in the night was so risky even her closest bodyguards advised her to wait for the Hua Shanai's army at Northern Mountain Road. She was considering this idea. She smiled again since both she and Little Wild were so safe now. Song and laughter quietly rose from the camp now after such a long trip. In the gloaming, a humble tent was set up outside the carriage circle, which was composed of 5 carriages and boxcars. Even the lead bodyguard earlier questioned the situation. The tent owner insisted on staying outside. "We stayed away from their carriages to get away easier in case something bad happens," Nink explained sarcastically. He asked Sang Sang to carry it bundled well with straw ropes, and then tied the ropes in a beautiful small flower. Sang Sang raised her head, looked at his new bearded chin, and asked, "What about them, if we run away?" While checking the bow to see if it was affected by the moisture, Nink turned his head. Looking at the handmaiden's small black face, he answered after being silent for a while, "You probably have forgotten what happened when we were children, but I didn't forget. I saved you from digging through the pile of the corpses. I have experienced some miserable things, which normal people could never imagine. Sang Sang, you have to remember this forever. Life is difficult for us. We try our best to be alive in this world. Since we are alive now, we can't be killed easily." After saying this, Nink did not explain any more. He put the sharp swords back into their sheaths and tied them with rope. He then carried them secure on his back. Sang Sang did not ask more questions. She started to pack silently, using her small hand to check if each arrow was straight enough. She acknowledged when dusk came, that was the moment to escape with Nink. She was not afraid because when she was a kid, she had experienced passing through the forest at night on Nink's back so many times. At this moment, Nink's hand was frozen on the sheath. A hand lifted the curtain of the demure tent, and the maidservant walked in. Her smile faded right away when she saw what was happening in the tent. She intended to chat with Sang Sang, but what she saw were the owner and his handmaiden packing. She fingered out they were planning to leave right now. "What are you doing?" She stared at Nink coldly. "It's very suspicious for you to do that at this moment." After a moment of silence, Nink laughed and was going to explain. But his oracle quivered lightly, then his dimples disappeared. He looked unprecedentedly serious. He heaved the 3 swords on his back at once, pushed the maidservant away rudely, and walked out of the tent. The encampment was located outside of Northern Mountain Road, and warmly comfortable with no forest cover and bathing in the last bit of twilight. But, for the moment, it was covered in bloody red. The wind passed through the vibrant forest in the spring, making a roaring or crying sound. Nink frowned and looked at the deep forest, listening to the warnings in the wind, and he screamed suddenly. "Enemies attacking!" The deep sound revealed itself, and a thunderous arrow was flying straight to the heart of the luxury horse carriage out of the forest. Chapter 10. Bodyguards, as hard as rocks. Bam! As he stood near the luxury carriage, an arrow tore through a bodyguard's chest. The young man with whiskers, then, fell to the ground clutching his bleeding chest. The moment Nink shouted out "Enemies attack," the well-trained princess's bodyguard reacted immediately. The bodyguard bravely jumped onto the shaft and blocked the window of Her Highness's carriage. He didn't know where the arrow was aimed, but he knew Her Highness in the carriage must be the first target choice for enemies, and he would never let her be in danger. What the brave bodyguard thought was right, which, however, was at the sacrifice of his young life. Enemies attack. Protect Her Highness. Shields. Suddenly, bodyguards roared furiously and shockingly. Countless arrows were swishing from the deep of the wood like a storm, loud enough to muffle the sound of the wind, and making the place a danger zone. Though Nink kept a distance from the surrounding fleet, he lay down the moment the boughs snapped. He even remembered to push down Sang Sang and the maidservant, both of whom followed him to see what happened from the tent. He fell down to the ground with a plump, but it was lucky that layers of rotted leaves and pine needles for leaves accumulated through hundreds of years in Northern Mountain Road served as a large cushion and relieved his pain when hitting on the ground. Face against cold leaves, Nink listened carefully to the dense sound of arrows whooping ahead and several ones passing above his head, doing a quick calculation of the number of arrows and archers. At the entrance of Northern Mountain Road were waves of annoyed and nervous voices. Some bodyguards were shouting to organize a defense, some calling out to make orders, and some screaming for backup. Among them, the sound of putting up shields was clear. Those giant shields made by planks from the carriage were inserted deep to the edge of the shaft, which obviously they helped a lot. Rub-a-dub. Arrows were deeply inserted in those crude shields with thuds like the pounding of war drums, but much denser and more terrible. Once in a while, a bodyguard might give a grunt when he was shot by an arrow through the tiny space between shields. Since the horses didn't compare to those of the warriors of Tang Empire, they painfully fell down and rolled on the ground with a neigh of despair. A din of arrows whooshing, shields cracking, men grunting and horses neighing was enveloping the camp, which just seconds ago was filled with laughter and sunshine. But later, it became a total hell. Whoosh! An arrow hit into the mud inches ahead of Nink. Dirt and small pieces of rock splashed his face, making it red here and there. But his expression did not change. He laid flat on rotten leaves and pine needles in stillness. He eyed the spaces between the leaves over that arrow in front of him and then south down the Northern Mountain Road. Instead of ambushing the fleet in dense wood or taking them by surprise at night, the foes chose to start an attack as they just settled down at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, which was beyond Nink's expectation, although he has got natal instinct to danger since young. At dusk, they were going to meet Gushan Commander's troops. they would come to help when people in the fleet would easily get lax and turn slack. That hit the spot for the enemy. Vaguely noticing numerous figures at both sides of Northern Mountain Road and based on his previous calculation of thick arrows, Nink inferred there were approximately 60 enemies. 60 was not a surprising number. After all, they were in the territory of Tang and their target was a princess who was beloved by the emperor. If they intended to keep it a secret before or after this action, they were not allowed to command real troops but to choose those faithful suicide soldiers. Though the number of those suicide soldiers couldn't be large, Nink clearly knew that it was not the number of persons but the quality of fighters that could determine who would survive in a battle. A team consisting of fierce and fearless fighters was most terrifying. When bigwigs of empire planned such a shocking assassination, it was likely for him to involve cultivators in his team apart from their suicide men. Thinking of possible combat he might watch today in this place, Nink raised a kind of excitement he couldn't describe and sensed a sort of terror he has never had. "What bad luck," he murmured and turned his sight to the maidservant beside him. Except for a trace of panic and puzzle in her eyes in the very beginning, she did nothing wrong and calmed down quickly, which won a silent praise from Nink in his heart. Our enemies from both sides of woods crowded in. Those men dressed in grey military uniform of the Tang Empire didn't wear any mask or veil. Brandishing identical broadswords in hand, they dashed like a pack of wolves. Since they didn't cover their identity, obviously, this battle would not end until people on one side were totally swept off the world. Since they were in grassland, valiant barbarians around the fleet were horse-gang under the command of the princess. The storm of arrows aroused pugnacity in the fighters. Some set their crossbows to shoot swiftly, while others drew curved swords their waists with a battle cry. Blades clanged at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. In the chaos of grunts and cries, men were killed, bellies stabbed and throats cut open. Blood spouted from their bodies like fountains and painted the leaves red. This battle became violent the moment it began. No one retreated, however, no one turned back to escape. After all, great courage to bleed and a strong will to fight mattered more than techniques of killing them. Barbarians from grassland were proficient in archery. Calm and brave, they gained the upper hand over rushing enemies. People in wood fell down now and then, so barbarians charged in return with bellows and gradually controlled places around the fleet. Tough and valiant as they were, barbarians chose to guard their places rather than march blindly. Absolutely, barbarians adopted correct tactics, at least from Nink's perspective. Therefore, it puzzled him that the maidservant's facial expression grew grave and blue as if she were concerned about something. In fact, those courageous grassland barbarians had never experienced that particular kind of clash in Central Plains. Considering this, she intended to make a sudden rise and give commands to them. Nink would not allow her to expose herself and lead both Sang Sang and him into an awful situation. He clenched his right hand to hit her leg, which hence knocked her down. "Hey! You! What?" Glaring at his eyes, the maidservant slowly reached her right hand to her waist. Nink focused his attention on the battle and ignored her question. When he noticed the scene in the fleet, something occurred to him that made him quiver. Fierce killing at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road was still on, but a weird tranquility covered the fleet. Less than a score of guards from an elite troop of Tang, who must have accompanied the princess when she married into the grassland, were all down on one knee like statues. In front of a carriage sat an elder dressed in a worn robe, eyes closed. Protected by circles of bodyguards, he faced deep in the wood which was increasingly gloomy and dark. Nervously, Nink licked his numb lips and reached his hand to Sang Sang. He didn't know when his palms had sweated heavily, making his hands moist. Sang Sang took a glance at him and handed him the bow. Then, she mutely undid the big black umbrella on her back and quietly placed it on fallen leaves beside her. Killings were still on. The fleet was in the middle of the three prostrate on leaves in the battlefield. Battles between barbarians and suicide soldiers seemed not to affect them right away. Nonetheless, Nink was in anxiety he has never met before and his palms and brow continuously sweat. Those stone-like bodyguards beheld the wood icily, with calmness and fortitude on their sunburned faces. They are alerted but not dreaded. They came from Yulin Royal Guards in Chang'an and were picked up to accompany Princess Li Yu into grassland when she married. No doubt that they were among the most elite members of the troop. In this battle, however, at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, their performance was a little bit unusual. When storms of arrows attacked them from the obscure and dark places deep in the woods, they responded quickly by falling in around the defensive formation and hid silently behind shields. When opponents flocked to kill them, they maintained their postures in stillness, regardless of violent fights and killings around them. Occasionally, one of the grassland barbarians of their side might be killed all of a sudden right under their nose. Once in a while, dead bodies might bump into shields with thuds. They maintained their postures without even a wink and kept gazing glacially at the woods with both heart and body as sturdy as iron or rock. Down on one knee, the bodyguards dressed in cotton clothes from edges of which parts of armor could vaguely be seen. They bent their hands toward their backs and clenched the hilts of their broadsword which stuck out. They had 2 carriages closely surrounded and kept staring forward with poker faces. One of the 2 carriages was luxurious and creepy silent. And in front of the other carriage, the only elder in the fleet sat with legs crossed and eyes closed. He placed a sword upon his knees to feel at ease. The sheath was shabby and frayed, just like the robe he wore. It seemed that poker-faced bodyguards around the elder couldn't see fierce fighting and hear any cries. Only when 1 or 2 enemies were about to intrude their territory did one of them pull out a broadsword and joined others in the killing. Being outnumbered helplessly, the guard who dashed out alone was quickly injured and kept on fighting bravely with blood covering him. Nevertheless, other bodyguards were not disturbed at all. They refused to be a little further from the elder and remained to stay with him in tranquility. It appeared that even their eyelash didn't move. Nink had no idea why bodyguards behaved like this or what was hidden in the dark woods. They stared alertly, but he was sure there would be something extremely horrible. He thought that he could guess what would happen. A splendid new cold world would be unveiled and come to reality, which made him exceedingly nervous. It was a horrid feeling for him, so he rubbed the bowstring with the index finger and middle finger, silently and constantly. A moment later, his breath marvelously slowed down and expressions on his face appeared more steady and composed. An air of repression emerged due to unspecified terror when they waited. Abruptly, fierce fighting around the fleet as well as clanging blades seemed to disappear. Right at this tense moment, the window of the luxurious carriage was pushed open and a young beautiful girl reached out with her bun loosening a bit. Her face appeared worried. Before she could say something, the poker-faced leader of bodyguards whispered, "Take care, Your Highness," and swiftly closed the window to block her eyesight. His facial expression showed he was respectful and cautious, but his action appeared rude, which probably resulted from the tense situation. Chapter 11. Sword held across knees, sword drifting among blood merely a scapegoat for the bigwigs. As Nink thought about this in his mind, he sensed a cool gaze from beside him. He turned around to find Sang Sang staring at him quietly. Nink felt they had been looking at each other for a very long time, but it was really just a few seconds. Nink felt frustrated in the face of his handmaiden again. He sighed in his mind and tightened his leg muscles. Then he pressed his feet against the pile of fallen leaves, sinking into the wet mud underneath, so that he was ready to sprint at any time. In the depths of Northern Mountain Road, darkness expanded as the sun began to set. Suddenly, a ruthless wind hurled through the greyish tree branches. Some fresh sprouts hiding under the old bark were spared from it, though the pile of fallen leaves on the ground rustled and whirled around in the air before falling back on the ground helplessly. Despite it being springtime, boundless forest leaves showered down. A hulking man in dark armor appeared in the depths of Northern Mountain Road, and after a deafening roar, a subtle earth-colored light radiated briefly through his armor, like a glimpse of the gods above. He raised his solid and broad arms as he lifted a massive boulder and hurled it briskly toward the luxurious carriage. The force was so terrifying and inhuman, practically resembling that of a long-range boulder sieging machine. The massive boulder approached at such a high speed that it managed to crush all the tree branches in its way. Hundreds of meters was no obstacle as it almost instantly hit the first carriage with acute precision and cruelty. After an explosive sound, The seemingly well-structured luxurious carriage shattered into pieces, with blood and broken limbs scattered in a mess. Those Tang bodyguards looked calm with swords in their hands, as if oblivious to the fact that the carriage behind them had just become a pile of trash and the princess whom they defended had died already. They did not even seem to be surprised and, even stranger, their faces even showed a hint of relief and calmness. "First team, shoot," ordered the leader. 3 of the subordinates remained down on one knee and released their knives to pick up powerful military crossbows. Aiming toward the depths of the forest, they swiftly pulled the triggers. 9 arrows hit the body of the godlike, hulking giant through flying leaves. But he just waved his hands to flick away the 2 arrows aimed at his face and completely ignored the ones that shot his chest. His rock-hard hands were slightly numbed by the high-speed arrows, and the ones that stuck to the armor on his chest soon fell to the ground. Given the slight trace of blood on the arrowheads, he most likely just suffered minor injuries. The arrows did not do much harm because of the long distance. The bodyguard leader had foreseen that already and kept his calm. Looking at the giant shadow far away up Northern Mountain Road, he raised his right hand and shouted, "Stand by." The 3 bodyguards put down their crossbows and held their knives upright again. Nink was trying to find an opportunity to save the poor scapegoat in the carriage since Sang Sang wanted him to do that. However, things had changed too fast. The giant had appeared too soon for him to react, and the huge rock fell out of nowhere and crushed the carriage with no warning. The woman was killed instantly before Nink even got there. He looked quite upset while looking toward the depths of Northern Mountain Road, perhaps out of sympathy for the nameless woman, or perhaps it was more for letting down his little handmaiden. Some secret art of cultivation enabled the giant to obtain such incredibly aggressive power. But he still had to pay a big price to toss that massive boulder over such a long distance. Now flushed and panting, with sweat spewing out of his armor, his legs could not stop shaking and he looked visibly exhausted. For some reason, the dozen poker-faced bodyguards chose to stay alert around the second horse carriage despite such a great opportunity for them to attack. Nez the elder in the robe sat still in the carriage with his eyes closed, seemingly undisturbed. Suddenly, the old man's long white hair moved like a silver river flowing on his dirty robe. The old sword in front of his knees started to make a humming noise and hit the sheath incessantly as if eager to drink blood and harvest lives. Hum, hum, hum. Zen. There was a sharp sound of singing metal. The shiny short sword bolted itself out the sheath and became a beam of blue light shooting toward the depths of Northern Mountain Road at a high speed, rushing through the leaves and air, ready to pierce through the giant body that it was aiming at. There seemed to be an invisible mirror between the Northern Mountain Road's twilight and the thick dark forest. As the shiny short sword shot like a beam of light, there was a hazy, sword-like grey shadow coming hastily. That grey shadow looked like a streak of lightning. It was seen among the flying leaves first but instantly arrived at the Northern Mountain Road battlefield. The deep humming sound had now become a roaring storm in the blink of an eye. The grey shadow was surprisingly fast, and its power had shattered all the leaves within its range. Those leaves formed a line behind the shadow, which aimed directly at the elder, who was now swordless. The great sword master. Looking at the beam of grey shadow that had the power of a storm, the bodyguards who had been calm as stone finally got anxious and some of them yelled to watch out. When the most powerful elder used his sword to aim at that giant in the deep forest, the strongest enemy who had remained hidden all this time decided to show up at last. And what a show it was! The enemy sent 2 cultivators with extraordinary power, including a great sword master, to assassinate the princess in the imperial territories. That was a terrifying fact, but the bodyguards showed no fear, only determination. Without hesitation, their leader shouted, "Chop! Zen! Zen! Zen!" With the continuous ringing sound of the swords, about 10 sharp swords came from out of their sheaths. The bodyguards held swords to chop in the clear space in front of them, they had no fear to fight. Each beam of sword light was quite sharp to cut the air and the intention from the hill. They were weaved into a closely meshed sword net to protect the old man who no longer had his sword. Just when the high-speed grey shadow was about to be chopped down by those swords, it abruptly paused in mid-air. Strangely, it turned to another side to avoid the dense attacks and then flew away. The shadow had already flown with thundering powder when it appeared in the northern mountain roads forest, seemingly unstoppable. But no one imagined how incredibly smart and swift it could be in a real battle. The grey shadow suddenly slowed down when it was turning around, and what it was could finally be figured out. It was like a dim shadow of a sword, so light that it could probably be blown away by the wind. This sword shadow was as thin as a cicada's wings and not as firm as a piece of paper. However, it was highly difficult to catch since its trace was like a ghost. When it turned its direction, it avoided one bodyguard's sword blade and cut his neck, leaving behind a beam of light blood there. That line of blood spread rapidly and then spurted out. The bodyguard held his sword with his right hand and put his left hand on his neck, but the blood still came out between his fingers. He stared at the depth of the forest and fell. He did not see that powerful sword master until his death. The grey sword shadow drew a curve and came back to the battle at blinding speed. It flew with a trajectory that was unpredictable and quickly killed 2 bodyguards. The bodyguard leader was still calm when he saw the blood drops flying slowly in the air. He held the hilt tightly and watched that beam of the grey sword shadow. Suddenly, he stepped forward with his left foot, chopped with his blade, and yelled, "Gather!" Upon this order, 4 bodyguards beside him waved their swords like flying snowflakes simultaneously, and they forced the grey beam of sword shadow into a small corner that was then condensed by the leader's sword power. The grey shadow was moving very fast and suddenly paused in the small corner before being hacked by the leader's blade. The leader had prepared for that, so he pushed the hilt with his left hand to tilt the blade upward and hit the grey shadow. With a clunking sound, that smart grey shadow fell on the ground covered by mud and leaves, just like a snake caught by its neck. This was the first time for Tang bodyguards to hit the great sword master's sword shadow. But there was no time to celebrate because the shadow started to shake again. The leaves quivered strongly and arched like a giant snake moving quickly below the bodyguard's feet. Suddenly, among the flying dead leaves and wet mud, the grey shadow came out like thunder and cut the aorta of a bodyguard in his thigh through his armor. The bodyguards fell one by one as they let out painful moans. They could strike that grey shadow occasionally, but they could not kill it. In spite of his sense of defeat and desperation, the leader still stepped forward with the sword in his hand and chopped again. "Gather!" he roared angrily. The remaining bodyguards all roared in unison while pouncing ruthlessly toward the grey shadow, hoping to build a final shield with their swords and their flesh. After 2 piercing sounds, 2 lifeless bodies fell to the ground, hardly making a sound. The bodyguard leader had half of his earlobe sliced off in a clean cut, and a few more bloody wounds were added to his body, looking like the work of a drunken calligrapher. After being hit by the bodyguards for the 7th time, the grey sword shadow finally slowed down, but it resisted falling and kept flying slowly across the blades, until it eventually got closer to the old man. Then the grey sword shadow was finally able to be seen. It was actually a hiltless mini-sword with a dim and particularly thin blade that did not have a trace of blood on it. The bloody bodyguard leader was on his knees, thinking disconsolately. 1 shot, only 1 shot, and he and his brothers would have accomplished the impossible mission. But after all, it was the great sword master they were fighting against. A long time seemed to have gone by, but in reality, it was merely the time it took a few blades to thrust, sword shadows to drift, and blood to splash. Throughout all this time, the old man in an old gown sat in the horse carriage with his eyes closed as if he had no idea of how much danger he was in. Meanwhile, no one seemed to notice how the elder held his hands lightly above his knees as they were shaking slightly, his thumbs pressing against the pulp of index and middle fingers of both hands in very brief and subtle movements, as if performing some kind of intricate calculations. When the hiltless mini-sword flew toward him and stopped just a few inches from his forehead, the old man finally opened his eyes. Once he looked at the sword, it froze right there in the air. The almost forgotten giant in the deep forest was shocked by the shiny sword he had just crushed with his hands, and he finally figured out what was going on. He looked up and roared in panic, "He's not a sword master. He's a psyche master." Chapter 12. Buzzing, sighing, the sword, the dim, Matt's small sword seemed to be aware of why the giant roared and that it fell into a trap. It started to vibrate fiercely in the air, making an echo of buzzing sounds as if it was a chaotic bird panicking that desperately desired to escape. With his hands on his knees, the elder gazed intently at the hiltless mini-sword, seemingly both tenderly and peacefully. This lingering gaze had a kind of horrible power that bound the small sword, making it impossible to move, let alone to flee. Suddenly, there was a sharp drop in temperature at the area where the elder set his eyes on. Covered with a layer of frost soon, the small sword vibrated more severely with a noisy and lasting buzz, but all its efforts were in vain. It seemed like a century before the small sword gave up this wasted struggle and voiced its last cry. The small sword fell upon fallen leaves, helplessly and lifelessly laying there. The moment the small sword fell onto the ground, an agonized grunt sounded behind a tree not far away from the fleet, somewhere within the woods of Northern Mountain Road. A trace of relief flashed in the elder's quiet eyes as he once again placed his hands on his knees. All of a sudden, as though blown away by a gale, the skinny and bony elder leaped from the carriage and stopped right in front of the giant man, deep within the woods of Northern Mountain Road. The giant man's huge palm burst forth with a howl and thumped upon the skinny old man like a mountain, so ferociously that the elder seemed to be crushed into a pile of flesh. However, the elder looked at the huge palm with a poker face and his dry lips moved, soundlessly uttering a foo. Then, with his smudgy hands crossed in front of his chest, the elder made an emblematic gesture. The foo word was mouthed from his lips, and the emblematic gesture formed by his hands instantly turned the elder's dirty and shabby robe extremely hard. Every ruffle in the cloth was smoothed. It looked as if the robe was supporting his skinny body rather than he was wearing the robe himself. The gust of wind produced by impact from the palm ceased abruptly. The palm had no way to move forward in front of the trembling elder's head. The giant palm came to a halt, the rest of his body grew stiff. Blood ran down from his canthi and his jaw quivered uncontrollably. Obviously, he was in mighty agony. The elder's face was extremely pale and he seemed to feel the strain. Nevertheless, he raised his right arm with difficulty as he stretched out very slowly towards the giant man's chest. Inhibited by sort of bizarre power and unable to move, the giant man could not help but witness the elder's palm getting closer inch by inch. Softly, the elder placed his palm on the giant man's chest. A hissing turbulence could be heard between the palm and the chest. With a dull thud, the giant man's stone-like sternum was fractured and his chest began to collapse inward. Meanwhile, riding on the powerful gust of winds created from the exchange, the elder shrunk his body and swiftly withdrew toward the carriage. The winds in the woods stirred his robe, causing it to roll around. He retreated back momentarily and sat down with legs crossed. It happened in a brief instant. The elder was once again seated with his hands on the knees again and his robe turned back to being ruffled and shabby. Everything appeared to remain the same. Finally, the giant man deep in the woods of Northern Mountain Road regained ability to control his body and that huge palm came crashing to the ground. Though the power of palm made a pit on the ground, it was too late. He stared at the bloody hole in his chest, cried desperately as well as regretfully, and fell down on the ground as if a mountain collapsed. Keeping his legs crossed, the elder sitting beside the carriage took a glimpse at that direction as he bent forward to cough intensely, to the extent that spots of red blood were spat onto the robe. Meanwhile, bodyguards had formed a team that fought against the small sword. With their broadswords in hand and without concern for their own safety, they bought precious time for the old man. During this time, the elder calculated and found out where the great sword master hid. Then, bridged by hiltless mini-sword, he used his psyche power to hurt the great sword master. He succeeded, but this attack greatly hurt him as well. When he leaped to kill the giant man, although it looked easy, it was in fact a risky move because if his psyche power in Ocean of Ki and Mountain of Snow had been used up and he would have been rather feeble. Fortunately, he had already won the battle. The battle in the entrance of Northern Mountain Road had ended. Horse gang in the grassland, guarding Princess Li Yu had proved their loyalty, bravery and mighty fighting capacity in this battle. Their curved blades slew all the opponent soldiers at a great cost. Those lucky enough to survive were totally covered with blood and too weak to stand. the number of bodyguards that were left alive or standing was much lesser. Wearing a complicated expression, the elder looked at the tree not far away. As the night was falling, the entrance of Northern Mountain Road appeared more silent. Bark was peeled from the tree like a man that had aged rapidly in a short period of time. It showed ominous spots indicating a rotten and broken body. A middle-aged scholar dressed in cyan cheongsam paced from behind the tree, a rounded scabbard sticking out from his back. Though he looked a bit old, he was handsome and would be considered elegant in brothels or entertainment boats in Chang'an local government. However, he had no business with grace or elegance at this time. Numerous tiny blood beads permeated pores on his face and hands, making him up to be a horrible, bleeding man. Moreover, parts of his cyan cheongsam were permeated likewise. His body concealed by the clothes was largely covered by those small bloody beads as well as his exposed face and hands. The middle-aged scholar raised his hand to sweep the blood on his eyebrow with his sleeve, gazed at the elder beside carriage and an empty scabbard beside the old man, and said with a complex feeling, "One careless move may lose the whole game." That Liu Qingchen of South School of Haoshan Taoism should abandon sword and cultivate psyche power. You can guess how many people would feel astounded if I spread this news. Keeping silent for a while, he continued. What is much beyond my knowledge is that you succeeded in stepping into the Dongsuan state at such an old age. Is it due to some secret art in Haoshan Taoism? The elder named Liu Qingchen answered softly, I followed the princess to live in the north for a year, enjoying quite different views, as well as different customs, and was inspired. Therefore, I stepped forward in cultivation state. I didn't think it was related to Taoism. Hearing this unexpected explanation, the middle-aged scholar froze for a moment as if he was thinking about something. After a long silence, he cast his eyesight to the chief bodyguard down on one knee in the fallen leaves, saying in a much serious tone, after I was upgraded to be a great sword master, I felt that average martial arts could never be my counterpart. But today, you're subordinate and you taught me a lesson. The middle-aged scholar made a fist and palm salute to the badly injured bodyguards, praised and said, It is great pride of our Tang dynasty to have fearless soldiers like you. The chief bodyguard nodded slightly without saying a word. There are not many great sword masters in Chang'an local government, but you are not one of them, Liu Qingchen said, looking at the bleeding middle-aged scholar, and he continued. Academy really is a place full of unknown masters. Hearing the word academy, those surviving soldiers couldn't help but feel shocked and confused. Was it possible for Lofty Academy to be involved in this assassination attempt on the princess? Ning subconsciously looked at the maidservant at his side. Though she seemed lost in thought, her expression said that she didn't think Academy was linked to the attack. The middle-aged scholar was surprised, shaking his head and bitterly answered, I didn't expect that you found out where I came. But I should not bring any shame to Academy. I was just a stupid apprentice expelled by Academy. Covered with blood and reeling, he would fall down at any time, but facing such a mighty enemy like him, the survivors, both the grassland barbarians and the bodyguards, nervously held their breath for any possible fight. Even though he was the only opponent left. Nink felt the same, filled with combined emotions such as excitement and bewilderment. Having heard the legends of those great cultivators when he lived in City of Wei and having studied article on the response of the Tao for many years, Nink has imagined what they could be. However, this was the first time for him to witness an authentic combat between great cultivators. It was said that intrepid generals in the military of Tang Empire had various crack techniques, but since the frontiers were at peace for years, an insignificant soldier in border town like Nink had no chance to watch a combat of this level. He couldn't help recalling what he had seen. The hiltless mini-sword flying freely among falling leaves, the giant man casting a gigantic rock to destroy a carriage, the old man, with eyes closed, that used psyche power to kill remotely. All of these incredible feats of magic emerged from his memory one after another and in such quick time, stirring his mind and unsettling his heart. As the three words, Academy, expelled, stupid apprentice, reached him, Nink became awake somehow, but fell into another kind of thrill. Imagine that a stupid expelled apprentice could kill 10 bodyguards from elite troop of Tang with just a small mat sword. how enormous and unbelievable the power of those real students in academy could be. He might be under the command of Xiaohu, the maidservant whispered frigidly. As the name of Xiaohu hit him, Nink's face turned serious and even his body became stiff. It took him more than several seconds to recover from this abnormal state, but his eyes were now icily judging the middle-aged man instead of praising him for his ability. You cultivate Horan sword skill. It is not difficult for me to guess where you are from. Liu Qingchen continued. It is a pity that you haven't learned much from the second floor of academy before you were expelled. At the beginning, the sword rose with momentum like wind and thunder, but was changed into something flexible and surreptitious. Liu Qingchen added. Being honest and untrammeled is top priority in Horin Kendo, but you didn't follow it. You fancy yourself smart, but this decision is boring indeed. If you had met the middle-aged me 20 years ago, you would not have defeated me either, even if I didn't step into the Dongsuan state. The middle-aged scholar lowered his head with a shallow smile, which appeared especially miserable at his gorgeous face covered with tiny blood beads. When he was invited to kill the princess and knew the level of the elder following her, as a great sword master in the Dongsuan state, this middle-aged scholar dressed in Cyan Qiangsam thought it more than easy to finish his task. Nevertheless, the information he got had not included that the elder had stepped into Dongsuan state. To everyone's astonishment, the missionary of South School of Haoshan Taoism had abandoned the sword and chose Psyche. Even so, Great Sword Master still had a chance to win. Nonetheless, he didn't expect those that bodyguards of Tang that were positioned around the carriage could actually make so much trouble for him either, and his location was found by Liu Qingchen. It was perilous for a great cultivator's location to be found by his rival on the same level, Psyche Master in particular. Liu Qingchen controlled his small sword first and took it as a bridge to hurt him with Psyche power. Facing a Psyche Master famous for killing speed, he had no way to react but was attacked by the Psyche power which directly rushed into his ocean of ki and mountain of snow, ruined his viscera and broke his blood vessels. He was doomed to die at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road this day, so he would not mind those comments from Liu Qingchen. Though something else was more imperative for him to do before he would die. Chapter 13. The Devil's Severed Finger and the Military's Wing-Footed Arrow. After speaking the last word, Liu Qingchen started to cough heavily again. Psyche Masters were the most mysterious group of cultivators in the commoners' imaginations. But there is one thing that others would never know about other than the group itself, that is, the mysterious Psyche power would actually hurt the Masters mentally, and even physically, while they fought against their enemies. Looking at the piled corpses lying far away, Liu realized that the Empire had lost two precious elites and felt deeply pity, saying, though we have a number of powerful elites in the Tang, few of them can reach the state of a great sword master. You, who have been educated authentically, were supposed to serve your country. How could you betray your country and become a traitor? Traitor? What do you mean by a traitor? Sir, you are from Haoshan Taoism, you must know how they criticized the imperial astronomer when it was erased, night covers the stars, country is in turmoil. By judging bodyguard's facial expressions, the middle-aged scholar had already confirmed that the target is not in the carriage. The dead woman was just a bait. He glanced at the broken, garbage-like, gorgeous carriage, and said disparagingly, I don't care what General Xiaohu is thinking, but I know we have the same goal, kill that evil woman in your troop. The Imperial Astronomer event several years ago came into Liu Qingchen's mind. He said, after seconds of silence, shaking his head, the basic principle of the Academy was remaining realistic and practical. I would never believe these ridiculous ideas even being from Haoshan Taoism, not to mention that you would. I have followed the princess for over 4 years and never thought she would suffer all of this. Hearing such secrets that normal people would never know, Nink seemed to realize the reason for the princess to insist on marrying Chanayu years before, and why the emperor would agree in the end. Just thinking about this, he couldn't help but turn his head to face the pretty maidservant beside him, who was looking extremely unpleasant. Complicated moods that showed on the middle-aged scholar's face were gradually fading away, and he stopped answering Liu. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The leaves around him started swirling along with his breath, and his robe also started making noises. What else do you want to do? Liu frowned looking at him and said, "You aren't getting better even after 77 breaths. Your viscera probably have been broken and the ocean of ki has been ruined, the same as your natal sword. Now you even can't beat a normal soldier. Are you not even willing to find your inner peace before leaving this world?" In normal people's minds, cultivators like sword masters and psyche masters all could use the ki of heaven and earth. Some foolish villagers even believed that those cultivators with the strongest powers were able to control their lives. As a result, those badly injured barbarians and bodyguards dare not let their guards down, even though the middle-aged scholar was dying. Upon hearing Liu Qingchen's words, they finally believed that the great sword master was dying, as their pain and tiredness started to overwhelm them. Ning still remained alert, throughout the war, hiding in fallen leaves just like a quail. He stared at the middle-aged scholar in a pool of blood, moving slowly with his bow and arrow in his hand, and looking for the best position to shoot. To the Tang, no matter if officials or normal citizens, honor was way more important than their lives. To them, even their enemy deserved respect according to his status when he was fighting to the death. Now as the respected great sword master was dying, the heads of bodyguards bowed their heads to demonstrate their respects towards him, even if the master had killed lots of their loyal underlings. That was the reason why Liu chose to talk with the master to clear his doubts, so that he could give his last words before the master's death. Ning could never be regarded as a typical Tang. He did value honor, but he had never thought of it as important as life. He didn't believe that there's something more valuable than life, and even if there was, it would never be an honor. I bet he was just a low-level soldier in a border town, knowing nothing about these powerful cultivators. This was the first time for him to see such an unbelievable battle. However, considering that the great sword master was the enemy now, he would keep alert and be ready to put him down with any methods. Being homeless since youth, and fighting against barbarians in the frontier fortress for several years, the youngster had developed a deep-rooted awareness. The safest enemy was always the one who had already died, and only when the enemy was dead, might he take off his cap and salute with his eyes to show his respect to the enemy. And exactly at that moment, things happened just as he expected. With leaves swirling rapidly around the big tree, the middle-aged scholar's bloody, wet, indigo robe was blown outward suddenly. Several streams of blood were spurting out from all his facial orifices. All of this seemed like there was a horrible invisible power rushing into his body from those swirling leaves and from all directions, driving his power out through the blood coming out of his body, absorbing the universe within. Looking at this, Liu made an angry face all of a sudden, shouting at the middle-aged scholar angrily, "Who uses dark methods in the academy? How dare you betray your mentors and faith?" The battle went even more ferocious at the northern mountain road, while you could see nothing special on this old man's face. For the Tang, now that the battle had started off, death or failure were the most common things that could happen, with nothing to do with morality or justice. However, when he found that the middle-aged scholar ruined himself with dark methods, he finally couldn't help but get angry. If you are on a righteous path, why be afraid of using the dark method? The middle-aged scholar lifted his right arm slowly and pointed to the elder man beside the carriage and said, "Let me be lost in the underworld for good if this is damnation." The moment that he spoke the last word, one more stream of blood appeared suddenly at the bottom of the index finger of his right hand. The bones inside appeared, slightly, as well. With a painful moan, the finger was ripped off of his hand, and the blood flow spurted out onto Liu's face. Containing the key of heaven and earth inside his body, molding his flesh and blood into flying swords, compressing energies throughout his life into one shot, those were the most typical dark methods. For the group escorting the princess, Liu was their most reliable person, especially when all of the barbarians and guards were badly wounded and dead. If he was murdered by this finger, then no one in this world could withstand the attack of the great sword master. Two grassland barbarians rushed to the middle-aged scholar, shouting. Yet, they fell down on the leaves after 2 steps. Their curved knives slipped out of their hands as well. The leader of guards fell to the ground, crawling down and forward, bleeding. There was a crossbow arrow left by a sacrificed guard nearby. Although he had struggled with his full strength, he still fell far behind. Even if he got the arrow, Lai would be too weak to be struck by the broken finger. In the dark forest of the northern mountain road, no one would expect that a great sword master, who was from the academy, would use the dark method. No one was prepared for this and could do nothing but watch him win the fight and see people die. However, Nink was well prepared. He had prepared for this for a quite long time. When that middle-aged scholar in the indigo robe sighed with emotion, he was not touched at all. In fact, he was carefully watching out for the party's movements as he gradually moved his body to look for a perfect spot to launch his attack. When the middle-aged scholar started absorbing the key of heaven and earth into his body and the falling leaves were swirling in the air, he had already stood up and aimed his boxwood bow at his opponent. Exerting force on his right arm and hand, the bowstring was pulled out like a full moon, and the enduring string stored tremendous force and continued buzzing. The arrow on the string was shaking slightly and quickly turned calm, like a snake ready to jump out. When the broken finger flew towards the elder, Nink slightly released his index and middle finger. Then the bowstring bounced back quickly and the arrow shot out like lightning through falling leaves and went straight forward into his chest. When. The bowstring vibrated violently. The black arrow flew like lightning and pierced through the falling leaves, tearing the night. Just before the great sword master's broken finger hit Lai with the dark method, it had shot into the scholar's chest. The bodies of cultivators weren't stronger than those of normal people. Especially masters of sword, psyche, and fu, due to meditation for years, they had become weaker and needed to pay closer attention to the environment around them, vigilant of attacks. In addition to the loyal guards defending nearby, they would wear light armor inside their robes in case of assassins attacking. With clear determination, at the last moment of his life, this great master did not hesitate to kill the strongest psyche master with the dark method. So he did nothing when he found that someone was attacking covertly. There was only a clear lake, which was formed by the key of heaven and earth, left in his psyche. The broken finger was just like a curved black string. He struggled to crawl forward and had to concentrate all of his spiritual force to strike the elder. He would never allow himself to be interrupted by anyone or anything, not even the cold arrows. Besides, there was a nice light protective armor beneath his indigo robe. He believed that the arrow which flew from nowhere wouldn't kill him at such a long distance. Pooh! With a muffled sound, an arrow, which was much quicker than normal arrows, hit his chest with its head swirling rapidly. The sharp arrow tore the robe apart into pieces and squeezed between the tiny openings of the light armor. The arrow was in his flesh and blood started to appear. The middle-aged scholar still seemed like he didn't care. He didn't even lower his head to look at it, and the bloody drops on his face came together to form a stream. It was painful with an arrowhead in his flesh, but it didn't matter as he wouldn't die from this. But Nink shot more than one arrow. Chapter 14. A blood flower bloomed on the indigo robe show. With the terrifying sound of tearing flesh, the second arrow followed the first one. It pierced into the chest of the middle-aged scholar, like chained lightning. The arrow hit the exact same place where the first arrow penetrated the robe and the armor. The third arrow was right behind the second, sailing straight through the others. Since his wound was no longer protected by armor, the third arrow penetrated directly into his body. Nobody knew how Nink did this. He used a regular boxwood bow to shoot 3 consecutive arrows in seconds. Furthermore, nobody could even imagine how this seemingly ordinary and young soldier obtained such terrifying mastery in archery, that he was able to shoot into the same tiny spot 3 times in a row. The middle-aged scholar felt like a hard and heavy wooden pearl crashed with such tremendous momentum into his chest that it pushed him back about 2 steps. He realized that there was something warm running down his chest, and seconds later that warmth became boiling hot. He looked down instinctively and saw an arrow penetrating almost all the way through his body. Only a small portion of the fletching was seen outside of his robe. Blood gushed out of his body and a blood flower blossomed on his indigo robe. Shocked, the middle-aged scholar looked down at the wet blood flower on his chest. An expression filled with absurdity and astonishment appeared on his blood-covered face. He lost all his strength and gradually fell to the ground covered with fallen leaves and mud. Even cultivators, who took advantage of dark methods to absorb the key of heaven and earth, could not control their minds after their hearts were pierced. The invisible string connecting heaven and earth was torn apart the moment the middle-aged scholar fell down. The bloody and broken finger, which had completely lost control, could not threaten a Psyche Master anymore, even if the Psyche Master was extremely weak. Liu Qingchen raised his eyebrows and shoved the broken finger out of his way. The broken finger flew past his face and towards the carriage behind the elderly. Then half of the carriage was destroyed and broken into pieces with a little collapsing noise. A tiny portion of the key of heaven and earth absorbed by the middle-aged scholar was charged into the broken finger. Although the broken finger had lost its control, it could still cause a lot of damage. It definitely could have hurt the elderly seriously without the help of the 3 arrows. And the ambush would have embraced in an entirely different end. All the surviving guards and soldiers understood this, but the scholar was the one who knew this best. He stared at the arrows in his chest and painfully struggled to raise his head, looking towards the back of the carriage formation to see what the shooter looked like. Using his superior mastery of archery, Nink had shot 3 arrows at the most important moment. These arrows pierced the armor and surprisingly was able to kill a great sword master. He turned the tide of the situation and saved the Tang princess from absolute danger. Is it the time for him to accept the surprise, gratitude and even worship of all the people who were present? Nink, however, did not think so. There was no relieved smile on his face. He still held his boxwood bow tightly and kept his arrows drawn. He aimed at the great sword master sitting under the tree, with his ears focusing on the light rustling sounds of the forest. He stayed cautious. Xiaohu! 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 Nink had been repeating this name to himself in his mind after a maidservant told him that the great sword master might be Xiaohu's subordinate. Besides, the great sword master had admitted that before. Xiaohu was not called Xiaohu XX. His last name is Xia, and his first name is Hu. As one of the 4 most influential great generals in Tang, his kung fu was among the highest level and he had achieved many military accomplishments. The man was extremely brave yet cold and ruthless, famous for being brutal and warlike. He was stationed at the Fierce Willow Battalion. However, while his last name was Xia, he did not allow his children to use Xia as their last names. Instead, he changed his children's last names to his full name. His oldest son was called Xiaohaojing and his second son was called Xiaohaowei, and so on. When the court's intellectuals asked about it, Xiaohu answered arrogantly, "I want to create a last name for myself and I am the ancestor, which will be passed down for thousands of centuries. Therefore, the family name from now is Xiaohao." General Xiaohu was a celebrity. It was not, however, for this reason, Nink kept remembering his name in his mind, from shocking narrations to disappointment, and then to irony. Bears this name, seemingly engraved into blood and arrogance, had always been deeply buried in Nink's mind since he was 4. He had never met Xiaohu before. But he knew Xiaohu's hobby, his favorite concubine, and why Xiaohu had boiled and killed its concubine. He also knew that Xiaohu would eat 3 kilograms of mutton at every meal, and even his daily toilet routine. He believed that he was the person who understood the Tang's famous general most. None in the world wanted to kill this man more than he did. Under the rough and arrogant appearance of that general, there was a cold and cunning heart. He was harsh and ruthless, but he only trusted his own hands. Therefore, he would never rely solely on the middle-aged scholar, who obviously was not his descendant, to assassinate the princess. The general would definitely send his most loyal assassins and subordinates to observe this ambush. He himself might jump out at a key moment to finish the task. It was the best moment, in Nink's perspective. A crying little boy poked his head out of the half-collapsed carriage. A pretty maidservant raised her dress and ran towards him nervously. Nink extended his right arm as quickly as a thunderstrike and knocked her down. The tree branches over their head snapped and broke into pieces, obscuring the sight of any onlookers. 2 masked men dressed in black appeared in the debris. They quickly threw 2 metal balls at Nink and unsheathed their long swords from their backs. The scene was very cold and scary. The 2 accelerating metal balls were painted with red dots. They were kerosene grenades equipped by the elite forces of Tang's frontier armies, and their burning effect was extremely horrifying. Nink was familiar with these grenades as he had spent a lot of time in the frontier fortress. He threw the bow away as quickly as he could and reached out for the hilt on his back, and then he screamed, "Umbrella!" Chapter 15. I have 3 pod as just one word, umbrella. There wasn't a verb before it. Also, Nink didn't call out the name of Sang Sang. Nink and his handmaid had been living together since childhood. After spending several difficult years in the mountains and forest and on the grassland, the two of them could easily understand each other and exhibited great teamwork. Just eye contact, a gesture, or a word was enough to clearly convey what one wanted to do. The moment the word umbrella was uttered, Sang Sang, like a squirrel, quickly ran beside the maidservant and shook the umbrella hard, with 2 hands holding the handle. Then the black umbrella, dramatically huge compared to her thin body, was opened with a whoo sound, as if a dark sky curtain had suddenly appeared over the thick forest of the northern mountain road at night, blocking the light of the stars. 2 kerosene grenades fell on the ground and ignited rapidly. The blazing fire rolled the fallen leaves up, which further aided the combustion. All at once, the area was surrounded by the unstoppable raging flames. The live bodyguards and grassland barbarians around the carriage team looked at the fierce fire and thought of the noble that was hiding there. They were seized by trembling from head to foot. Unable to help the noble due to their serious injuries, they, desperately screaming, had no choice but to helplessly watch as the incandescent fire was engulfing everything inside it. However, they didn't notice that the big black umbrella still remained intact. The incandescent and ferocious fire grotesquely became weak when it touched the oily and sticky curtain of the black umbrella. What on earth was the umbrella's cover made of? Miraculously, not only could it block stars like a black sky curtain, but also ward off the fierce fire. Below the big black umbrella, Sang Sang, who was thin and nervous, lowered her head as she closed her eyes and lips. Her 2 hands tightly held the handle of the umbrella, which withstood the horrible fire close at hand. Her left hand held the handle held tightly, but then became temporarily relaxed again. It seemed that she was very tense or was struggling with something in her heart. The maidservant, with her slightly curly hair swinging between her delicate eyes, was also sheltered by the black umbrella. She became extremely nervous with the intensely high temperature and the sight of the blaze sprawling across the black umbrella. Then, a sense of confusion and shock appeared in her eyes the moment she noticed, through the side of the black umbrella, that the fighting was about to unfold. The assassins in black had hidden and prepared in the forest for a long time. They finally figured out where their target was after silently watching and analyzing the countermeasures of the princess guards. Then, with the great sword master and the giant cultivator managing to distract Liu Qingchen, they gradually moved towards the target area and suddenly launched an attack. Countless sawdust from the trees fell to the ground. The 2 assassinators in black made a relentless and accurate raid with perfect timing. After throwing 2 kerosene grenades, they quickly attacked Nink from a short distance. In this way, it was impossible for Nink to make use of his excellent archery. They were not mighty cultivators, but they were much more professional being assassins than the cultivators. On this night with the stars filling the sky, there were few changes or signs of panic appearing on Nink's face as the 2 assassins suddenly appeared. He just threw away his bow and arrows like shabby shoes, and then jumped with force just when the 2 kerosene grenades touched the fallen leaves. The muscle in his waist, abdomen, and legs tightened and relaxed suddenly. Without any run-up or preparation, his legs, as if equipped with a spring, leaped from a still condition. At the very same time, the kerosene grenades began burning and his shadow was just over the fire. It looked like that he, stepping on the incandescent fire, was drifting through the flames. Nink forcibly flew through the violent blaze, with his hollow fist swinging naturally from the side of his face to behind his body. His legs inclined backward and his body slanted forward in a very natural and coordinated movement, like a bird attractively gliding. Meanwhile, his hollow fists were close to reaching the 2 hilts that were resting askew on his back. As he leaped through the fire and into the air, Nink kept his attention on the 2 assassins in black. Only calmness, concentration, and peace could be seen from his expression, without any distracting thoughts. A grave O with double acute grave. The black maidservant, looking through the tiny gap of the black umbrella at Nink's figure jumping out of the flame and the calmness on his face, somehow, felt extremely cold from head to foot. At this moment, it reminded her of what she witnessed as she followed Chani to hunt on the grassland half a year ago. In that situation, a young and fierce tiger leaped through the shrubs and pounced on her, with its forepaw slightly holding her and its hind legs gently and deftly contracting. However, only extreme calmness and concentration appeared in its eyes, without any cruel and bloody expression. For one fleeting moment, a quality of calmness, even grace, was attached to the beast. For her, unfortunately, the expression in its eyes was the most formidable one she had ever seen, and sometimes she was even woken up by the calm and peaceful staring of that tiger in her midnight dreams. Calmness without any emotion represented mightiness and confidence, and concentration signified volition and determination. As tigers went for prey, they attacked in a focused and sober, but not grim, way. It was just their talent and instinct for survival to tear all enemies into pieces, not that they want to release its anger, they just had to be clear about their gift or aptitude. That memory and thought appeared in her mind when the maidservant saw Nink's face reflected from the blaze. The assassin who had been killing other people at night their whole life was the most sensitive creature to danger. Even the maidservant could feel the resolution and cruelty hidden behind Nink's calm and concentrated expression. The two assassins in black, as they watched the lad leap over the fire, were also subconsciously shocked and nervous, even more nervous than the time they had assassinated young cavalrymen in the past. Their hands had strangely become a little stiff as they held onto their long swords. Accompanied by a whistling wind, Nink jumped between the two assassins, with his burning cotton robe tails depicting several feeble flames among the thick forest at night. Two rusty podaers were quickly pulled out from behind his shoulders and went straight at the enemies. Then, a string of impact sounds made by metal blades suddenly occurred in the forest. When the wind became more violent, the feeble flames were divided to subtler sparks, which brightened the battlefield more than before. The podaers and swords furiously collided. Nink bounced forward, landed on the fallen leaves, and then forcibly stepped into the middle of the two assassins after several paces. His wrists controlling the podaers changed their direction, slantingly dragging his weapons up, like lightning, to the enemies through back edge of their swords. Completely outperforming his opponents, Nink directly gashed into their ribs accompanied by two sounds, leaving no chance or room for them to respond. The heavy blades diagonally and violently chopped apart the assassins' sternums and into their chests, with their blood and flesh squeezed out from the blades. The two assassins in black tragically uttered a howl. However, before their lives ended, they threw away their swords and caught Nink's two podaers with their hands and bodies, showing the strong willpower of tank soldiers. Just at that moment, another assassin in black appeared, like a ghost, with a sharp, short sword held firmly by both his hands and chopped straight towards Nink's nape. There was a third assassin in the forest. From any perspective, the two assassins should have been the last attempt. But surprisingly, they still kept another as a backup, which, while seeming needless, was full of ruthlessness and determination at the cost of the whole group's lives. Nobody had ever predicted such a circumstance, except Nink or his handmaiden under the black umbrella. 6. 2. The handmaiden, nervously huddling and closing her eyes as the third assassin chopped towards Nink, exclaimed the two words with all her strength. What could the two simple numbers warn of Nink? Were they a type of code or direction hint? In fact, she shouldn't have caught sight of that assassin. Even if she was able to accurately figure out the location of the assassin, what could Nink do as his two podaers were still stuck in the first two assassins' chests and hands full of blood? 6. 2. It's surprisingly high. Upon hearing Sang Sang's anxious shout, Nink made a complaint in his heart and then loosened his hands without hesitation, leaving his two podaers with the outraged assassins in black, who, before dying, tightly held the two podaers with their hands and lives. The fire was getting weaker and the sky was becoming darker. He raised his two emancipated hands over his head, gripped the hard hilt covered by a cloth bandage, and suddenly pulled out his last podaer that was on his back. Firmly holding the long hilt, Nink quickly unsheathed his podaer with a sure sound. Without looking back, he turned around with all the strength from his waist and abdomen, and then powerfully struck the long podeo in full strength, into the night sky. As if there was an eye on the back of Nink's head, the violent attack accurately chopped at the rapidly falling assassin in black, with the sharp blade fiercely throwing away the short sword held by the assassin. Then, Nink's podeo straightly and smoothly hacked into the killer's neck bone. The podeo kept its momentum without stopping, until it wedged halfway into his neck. The assassin, having no time to utter a hum, plummeted on the fallen leaves from the treetop, and then weakly kneeled down on the ground. Nink stepped back to reach the hilt stuck in the previous assassin's chest and then forcibly pulled the podeo out. Then he returned to the third assassin and chopped back-handed, with the blade penetrating from the other side of the neck and encountering the previous blade's path at the neck bone. With the blood spraying, the assassin's head dropped down with a click. The head rolled past his knees and the fallen leaves, and then went very far into the forest. In the past war between the Tang and the Yan Kingdom, the vanguard group led by General Xiao who once assassinated a great number of Yan cavalrymen. The secret group, having no cultivators, was made up of elite soldiers. But the group performed very intrepidly in the battlefield and had even managed to assassinate cultivators. The common people had no idea about the system of the mysterious group headed by General Xiaohu, but Nink knew clearly about it. He knew that each assassin team of Xiaohu usually undertook any action with 3 assassins. Therefore, since he was very young, Nink had been carrying 3 podeos on his back. Chapter 16. Nink, the wood chopper of Shubi Lake. For Nink, who had been used to surviving in forests, on grasslands, and among herds of beasts since childhood, it was those mysterious cultivators that disturbed him, but not the secret killers. Thus, after cutting off the assassins' heads with his podeo, he immediately retreated to the mild slope, where there still existed fire. Then he picked up his boxwood bow at once, and aimed at the great sword master again. This time, his vigilance seemed a little needless. The middle-aged scholar, the great sword master, in an indigo robe, without any movement, just silently leaned against a big tree. He looked at the lad in the firelight, with his black eyes on his bloody face, and muttered a few words. Then he died, with a helpless laugh and hands spread apart. Nink had been aiming intently at the great sword master's corpse for a long while, and he didn't lay down his bow until his arms began trembling. Immediately, tiredness and ache started invading his blood and every vessel. He asked without turning around, "Are you all right?" The flames, caused by kerosene grenades, lit fallen leaves, but the moist sapropel at the entrance to the northern mountain road gradually extinguished the fire. Sang Sang, half squatting and looking up at Nink's back, reclosed the big, black umbrella, which made a sound, and shook her head. It seemed that her young master could know what she had done without her words. The maidservant knew Nink was not concerned about her. She quickly stood up, raising her skirt's hemline, and sprinted to the carriage team, which was almost ruined. She wildly moved the heavy wooden box debris away. Then she eagerly embraced the dignified and strong boy, lovingly and gently flicking off the dust that was left on his face. About 6 grassland barbarians and Tang bodyguards were still alive. After struggling to stand on their feet, they trudged to the ruined carriage. The seriously injured bodyguard captain, leading others to kneel on one knee, mournfully said with his head touching the ground, "We subordinates deserve countless deaths as her princess is disturbed by the assassins due to our ineffective battle." It was not a sad picture that several men, covered in blood, kowtowed to the maidservant, who was hugging the boy while arrays of stars and remnant firelight were blazing. Instead, it was a picture full of bravery, or in other words, solemnity and valiance. Sang Sang walked close to Nink, and both of them just quietly looked at this scene. There was no need for them to pretend to show astonished or shocked expressions, as they had already figured out the real identity of the maidservant before. After a short rest, the guards and barbarians began, with difficulty, binding up wounds and applying medicines to each other. When their breath steadied, they commenced on cleaning up the battlefield, carrying back several severely wounded companions, and slaying all dying enemies. After that, these agile and brave men unconsciously looked behind them. Looking at the lad in a slight scorched, cotton-padded jacket, the bodyguards showed some very complicated expressions: shock, confusion, and even fear. The sight of Nink's capability convinced them that the lad had a good mastery of fighting and archery, but not a mysterious strong man beyond the imagination. In this battle, it was the bodyguards of Liu Qingchen who directly fought with the two mighty cultivators and depleted the majority of the great sword master's life, making it possible for Nink to end the enemy's life with 3 arrows at last. However, it furthered their feeling that the lad was a very formidable figure. When he began attacking, he could choose the perfect timing, with a precise angle and an effective approach. Additionally, a calm and tough heart was hidden beneath his gentle and young appearance. Undoubtedly, it was such an amazing performance to slay those 3 assassins in black with his 3 arrows. How did he manage to do it at such a young age? How many people did he kill in the border town of the grassland? And how many heads did he cut off? The bodyguard captain, leaning on a stick, trudged towards Nink and Sang Sang and then deeply bowed with his hands pressed together. Though without any thankful words, his innermost appreciation could easily and fully be told by the gesture. Leading Sang Sang by her hand to the side, Nink refused to accept the bodyguard captain's bow. These Tang bodyguards, who followed her princess to the grassland, as the dead great sword master previously said, deserved the respect of every enemy or friend due to their intrepid performance and strict military discipline. That was why Nink refused to accept his bow. The leader said, "I can tell that there aren't any patterns in your martial arts. Perhaps I can beat you if we battle barehanded. But I have to admit that if I were you, I would have been killed when the 3 assassins raided, let alone been able to slay them efficiently." Looking at Nink's immature face, the bodyguard captain, suppressing his shock, asked in a husky voice, "Lad, I'm very curious, where did you learn the ability to kill others?" Scratching his head and keeping silent for a while, Nink replied with a smile, "The ability to kill others, certainly, is learned from killing." Of course, he couldn't tell the leader that he had already known the name of Xiaohu since he was 4. And that, all the time, he had been making some preparations to kill, or be killed by, Xiaohu. Xiaohu, a powerful Tang general, had no idea that there was a lad, in a distant town of the frontier fortress, assiduously practicing fighting skills, analyzing the battling styles of all the mighty subordinates of Xiaohu, and summarizing countless countermeasures every day. Therefore, for Nink, the death of the 3 assassins in black was just an inevitable result of his painstaking practice that he did for over a decade. If the enemies were not Xiaohu's subordinates, for example, the bodyguard captain in front of him, he couldn't have achieved such a satisfactory victory. In today's battle at the entry to the Northern Mountain Road, Nink, after all these years, finally met with the subordinates of General Xiaohu for the first time. Maybe it was just an accident or an arrangement of fate. Anyway, Nink's podeo and archery, full of vengeance, had begun to show cold-bloodedness. The bodyguard captain, pressing his wounded chest, looked with confusion at the fearless lad and mumbled, "You're only about 16 years old, is it possible that you have killed more people than I have?" "If you count animals, then I really have killed a lot," Nink replied, smiling. "I'm referring to human beings," the bodyguard captain asked with emphasis, and then he explained at once, "I'm not interrogating you, and it's just out of curiosity." Nink, rubbing his face and looking at the leader, after a short silence said, "The major income source in the border towns is from killing the horse gang. Usually we call this activity chopping wood. During the past few years, it was I who led others to kill the horse gang in the city of Wei. Thus, regarding killing people, I did slay a lot." A grassland barbarian, who was standing behind the bodyguard captain and also wanted to know about Nink and to express his thanks, turned around and left without a word after hearing Nink's answer. His steps were a little hurried with his shoulders trembling. A grassland companion asked with confusion, "Dumu, what's the matter with you?" Dumu slumped down beside the bonfire, lifted up his wounded arm with difficulty and, slapping his numb cheek out of fear, said, "That lad should be the well-known wood chopper from Shubi Lake." This statement caused 4 grassland barbarians around the bonfire to acutely change their expressions. Nobody talked anymore. Someone sneaked a look at Nink and then quickly lowered his head, as he was afraid to be discovered by the lad. Before being subdued by her princess, the barbarians were horse gang members in the grassland, famous for their violence and toughness. However, for them, the Tang's mighty military border forces were the real horse gang. In every change of season, when the logistics supply was short, the Tang cavalries in towns of the frontier fortress would conduct an extra wealth-gaining looting operation on the grassland horse gang. The border forces of Tang Empire called it wood collecting. The horse gang described the bloody battle as wood chopping, and they referred to the most ferocious cavalry leaders as wood choppers. In particular, the wood chopper of Shubi Lake was the number one of all the wood choppers. That was the reason why the color of Shubi Lake turned red. He was the nightmare of the grassland horse gang, and he was the horror story told beside the bonfire. But before tonight, however, they had never thought that the wood chopper of the Shubi Lake was so young. Chapter 17. Out of the mountains with a little girl, this brutal and bloody battle came to an end. Something in the survivors' eyes had changed when they looked at Nink. Since they left the city of Wei, they might have perhaps treated him as a competent guide, but surely not a decision-maker. When it came to something important, he was no more than a large rock in their eyes. But now, with the end of this battle, everything seemed to have changed, as they would voluntarily consult Ning for anything. Having received approval from her princess, the bodyguard leader followed Nink's advice for their next move. They would not immediately retreat from the mouth of Northern Mountain Road, and rather, they would stay where they were for some rest and recuperation while hoping their aid would reach here before dawn. Liu Qingchen, pale and weary, silently watched the lad by the bonfire, with an imperceptible smile crossing his face. The elder rubbed his thumb against his index finger slowly, and then gently shook his head. 2 bonfires were made nearby the carriage. Although the forest and shrubbery were dense, there was no worry of a fire disaster, as the leaves were laden with night dew. The bodyguard leader and the others who were wounded gathered at one bonfire, saving another for her princess, the lad, and the elder. As bad as a situation like this was, the guards never forgot subordination. After binding the wounded and having some food, the grassland barbarians couldn't help drinking spirits and passing around bags of wine. When a bag passed to Sang Sang, she softly shook her head. The barbarian named Dumu walked up to Nink with a solemn and respectful look, passing his wine bag to him with both hands. Noticing this unusual scene, the princess raised her eyebrows and was certainly aware that, before they kneeled to her, these loyal barbarians were the unruly horse gang on the grassland. Seldom did they show their respect to someone who was not one of their kind. A distinct fear emerged on their face. Given what just happened, Nink did save their lives and they probably felt indebted, but where on earth did the fear come from? She wondered. Taking over the wine bag, Nink swallowed a gulp, instantly furrowing his brow. It was quite strong. With his heart pounding fast, Nink, seeing the elder sitting by the bonfire, propped up his weary body, stood up, and walked towards him. Before he could manage a bow or put his palms together devoutly, or even kneel down when he did as a child for respect and inquiry, a faint sound caught him unexpectedly. Sit. Nink turned his head, looking at the maidservant, whose face was glowing, lit by the firelight, and his heart gave out a soft sigh. Nink gave a salute to her in a reverent fashion, and sat down somewhere neither close nor far from her. He insisted, much different from what others appraised the princess to be, that she was a dimwit. Well, no matter what he thought of her, she was far superior to him, as a shining star in the sky was to a base worm in a paddy field. Therefore, he was still required to pay attention to his manners and be respectful. The reason for this was quite simple, which was that she was the 4th princess of Tang Dynasty, Li Yu, and by no means some ordinary maidservant. Examining Nink's young and plain face, Li Yu could not recognize anything special, except some speckles on his cheeks and dimples whenever he smiled, a couple of times perhaps. It was this ordinary soldier's valor in the battle that made her feel like she was watching a fierce tiger springing from the bushes for prey. For some unfathomable reason, a sense of calmness came over her as long as she knew Nink was around, though she still dreaded to think of the not-long-ago assassination. She thought, maybe it's this fearless tiger that's guarding me. The problem was that she did not like this lad whatsoever, based on what she observed since she pretended to be a maidservant. She quitted the disguise, finding herself still not able to take a liking to this little soldier's manner. To her dismay, she felt that what Nink did for her was mere pretense, not out of his heart, and even sensed that he often derided her behind her back. You must admit that a woman's instinct was sometimes her most powerful weapon, be it for rural housewives, or for sullen royalties in courtyards. The most honorable princess of the Tang dynasty had every reason to be angry as long as she thought someone was mocking her. Now, nevertheless, the princess felt a sense of comfort, security, and protection sitting together with him by the bonfire. She quite enjoyed this feeling, and yet was a bit dissatisfied with the fact that it was Ning who caused such emotions. Feeling somewhat embarrassed, she intentionally adjusted her tone to somewhat cold and insensitive. During the assassination earlier on, it seemed you that were trying to save me. Li Yu thought to herself, anyway, that was not me in the carriage at the time. Your intention to save the princess was no grander than your ambition to win honor for yourself. I knew you were the real princess since you were in City of Wei. Ning explained to her in earnest, as the maidservant was the real princess, so the one in the carriage should be someone else. This little act may be helpful when luring the enemy, but only a shoddy trick to the one who is observant. Frowning, Li Yu didn't ask him how he could recognize her real identity. She slowly formed a good impression of him after the battle, mostly because of the sense of security he gave her. She suddenly asked coldly, you said you learned your killing skills in the military, but till now you're only 15 or so. You were no more than a kid when you were enlisted. How come the military would enlist you? Planning to make up something to fool her, Ning thought, you married off to the faraway grassland at 16, why couldn't I be enlisted at that age? At that time Sang Sang quietly walked over and sat beside him. Watching Sang Sang sitting beside him and the dancing fire nearby her, Ning suddenly softened and said, you must already know that I met Sang Sang on the road. We were very little then, and were somehow lost in Min Mountain. We met an old hunter as we were almost dying of thirst. He raised his head, saw the princess profile, and continued, the old hunter was not a sage or master. He saved us, but this proved nothing. Anyway, he taught me how to hunt. Later, he died. I and Sang Sang, we lived off what I hunted in the mountain. Though a very simple and short account about his childhood, vivid pictures flashed before the princess' eyes. A 10-year-old boy carried a 5-year-old girl on his back, searching in a mountain full of beasts and perils. He carried a small boxwood bow and the girl had a barrel of arrows. They might get nothing for days, or might be chased by a leopard and fall off of hills. They might get excited just about a dead rabbit, or might watch the lights from a small village for a time from a distance, and then silently walk away. Now Li Yu reckoned that Ning seemed not to be as awful as he was before, and asked, living in the mountains is quite dangerous, why didn't you just go to the local council? The allowances for orphans in our country are generous and fair. Ning lowered his head, picked up a charred piece of wood and said in a soft tone, it's easier to live in a place with fewer people. Such a simple reason, but yet it revealed the kinds of hardship they had met. Li Yu stared at the two with no words, asking suddenly, how did the old hunter die? Ning lifted his head, and answered peacefully, I killed him, with a knife. As for why he did so, he didn't say further, and would not explain it to this princess, who would never understand how base and dark life was for people like them, and probably never to anyone. He caressed Sang Sang's little head gently, holding her in his arms closely. Chapter 18. Storytelling. Beside the bonfire, a chubby and lovely boy raised his head out of the arms of Li Yu, the princess. He took a curious look to the side, and then buried his head again into Li Yu's arms like the way Sang Sang was sitting beside Link. His face rubbed randomly against the princess, leaving snot all over her clothes. Li Yu, however, fumbled out her handkerchief to wipe his snot away somewhat clumsily, without any disagreeable look. She then turned back to Ning and indifferently, she said, how about serving me after arriving in Chang'an? I can promise you a good prospect. In his heart, Ning had already figured out the status of that little boy as a member of the tribe of savages, but yet he never expected that the princess favored her stepson so deeply. Moreover, he experienced a subtle change in his attitude towards Her Highness when he saw her wiping snot for the little boy. As expected, he was slow to reply with his mind occupied on these thoughts. He paused for a while before answering, Your Highness, I have to take the academy entrance exam after arriving in Chang'an. Different people perceived in different ways which, hence, produced different understandings. Those words could be regarded as Nink's regret over his inability to serve the princess, or his tactful turn down with a bit of self-confidence. Your Highness doesn't need to bother with my future. I could earn my own prospect so long as I am admitted to the academy. Are you sure you can successfully take the academy entrance exam, or even pass it without any hitch? Li Yu said dryly with a cold look, although our Tang Empire want officials with talents, the word want is not the one you normally understand. If men with talents could all find chances to make full use of their abilities, like what you have thought, then Scholar Lu from the previous dynasty would not have wasted his life so resentfully in brothels. Nink looked at her comely face and earnestly responded, I know what you mean, so I beg your Highness to wipe away those unnecessary obstacles for me. I don't want to lose the opportunity to enter the academy just because of my poverty. Li Yu also looked at him, yet with undisguised suspiciousness. She kept in silence for a long while, wondering what had made this youthful soldier refuse her invitation in such a calm and direct manner. After all, she was the emperor's favorite princess, and highly respected by the whole nation. Therefore, it was already a huge luck for Nink, a humble soldier, to keep such a close distance with her. If it were other soldiers in the border town, despite their qualification of taking the academy entry exam, nobody would escape from being moved to tears of gratitude and kneeling down to worship her in response to her invitation. Then she broke this long silence and said nonchalantly, I promise I will, because that's what I owe you. After uttering those words, she henceforth lost her interest to chat with Nink. She merely held the little boy tightly, staring blankly at the bonfire, with tears gradually moistening her eyes. At the moment, Liu Qingchen was still in meditation with legs crossed beside the bonfire to recover his energy, while those bodyguards at the other side had already sunk into a sounder sleep. Night came deep over the forest, with several chirps by birds that were occasionally stirred by the twinkling stars. Surprisingly, Nink caught the sight of her watery eyes, and following her vision, he saw that she was looking across the bonfire at the scene of the piles of corpses of bodyguards and grassland barbarians. Thinking of her wiping snot for the little boy and witnessing her lamenting over the death of her bodyguards, Nink's impression of this princess has somewhat changed. Silently he figured, even if she was an idiot, she was a humane kind of idiot. Sang Sang had fallen sound asleep on his knee, leaving only Li Yu and Nink still awake alongside the bonfire. The two continued sitting there without any words, and suddenly the little boy struggled out from the arms of the princess, rubbing his eyes and asking her to tell him a story because he couldn't fall asleep, which made Li Yu embarrassed. The stories she had heard in the palace during her childhood had already escaped from her mind, while the romantic stories she favored as a young girl were not suitable for such a kid. The boy, airing his grievance by being unwilling to look at his stepmother, and yet refraining from causing disturbances, looked quite pitiful. Nink just grinned aside at the embarrassed princess and gently made several coughs. The golden wheat, and the glossy green oats. The duck eggs cracked one by one, but nothing had happened to the biggest one. Mother Duck looked at her big and ugly baby paddling cheerfully in the water, and proudly said, Look, she is not an annoying turkey, she is my baby, but she is too ugly, and others will make judgments of her wherever she goes. The wild duck said, Anyway, it has nothing to do with us so long as she doesn't marry any of the ducks from our family. One night, when the glorious sun set towards the western wilderness, the ugly duckling saw a flock of big birds flying out of the woods, whose beauty had never appeared in her life. They were bright white with slender and soft necks, unfolding their beautiful wings and flying to warm states. When winter had passed, the ugly duckling found she was surrounded by some big swans, which made her extremely ashamed because in her mind she was so ugly. However, those big swans were tenderly pecking at her feathers. And suddenly she glimpsed at her reflection in the water and unexpectedly found it was so beautiful. When spring came, the sun shone warmly again. The lilacs dangled their branches into the water and people began to sing and dance cheerfully when they saw the ugly duck. They excitedly yelled at her, Look! How pretty that swan is! Nink randomly drew something on the ground beside his feet with a piece of scorched wood. With a smile he told it very old story with his head lowered. The story sounded simple yet indicated mixed feelings of sorrow and happiness. The little boy listened with his eyes opened widely, his body lying on the princess, and even the princess herself had been engrossed in the story. It hadn't been noticed that Sangsang woke up and joined them. She had heard the story when she was very young but still listened carefully, with childlike smiles occasionally emerging on her face. The night went deeper, and finally the children fell into a sweet dream when the story had finished. All of a sudden Li Yu opened her mouth after a long period of silence and said, "Your story is too profound for little while to understand. But I still have to thank you for reminding me of these things. I'll learn from that mother duck to treat him as my child and be proud of him. He'll never be mocked at and even discriminated against after we return to Chang'an. But whether he can soar up like that swan, it all depends on himself." Nink rubbed his head with a smile and then responded, "Actually, I haven't thought about it so much. It's just a story that I trumped up to comfort Sangsang when she was a child, because she always felt self-abased for her duckish and not so pretty appearance. Anyway, it's a good story," Li Yu smiled and said, "and it sounds encouraging for a disdained ugly duckling to finally grow into a respected white swan through her effort." The hand of Nink holding the scorched wood slightly stiffened. He then raised his head and said earnestly, "You have misunderstood me. This story is desperate to a larger degree, because it's impossible for an ugly duckling to grow into a swan. And she can, because originally she is a swan, just like your highness and the little prince in your arms. But a real ugly duckling will in no way grow into a swan." Li Yu silently stared at this lad. Reflecting on his words, she faintly understood something. Chapter 19. Your beauty is to blame being derived from a fairy tale. Their dialogue seemed to be quite profound. It seemed to plunge headlong into the lake of life and become slag showing no sign of appearance. But, after given careful thought, one realized the two speakers were no more than two youths of 15 to 17 years old. Once they had taken off their clothes of a distinguished princess and a shoe-lake wood chopper. There were some situations, like being stuck in the bottom of an icehouse well, where a person would forget things like status and wealth, and their interactions became pure. In the forest, next to the northern mountain road that had just experienced a bloody battle, beside a burning bonfire, the Tang Princess Li Yu and Nink simply became a story listener and a storyteller. Because the wounded were sleeping all around, the storyteller lowered his voice, which caused the story listener to lean forward to get closer. As a result, they were naturally sitting together, shoulder to shoulder, huddled around the bonfire to talk about some meaningless gossip before they went to sleep. After an unknown amount of time, the darkness gradually dissipated and the sky above the forest changed from a blanket of stars into the faint light of dawn. From the southern part of the northern mountain road came the rapid sound of horses' hooves. Liu Qingchen and Nink opened their eyes at the same time, exchanged glances and then woke up the rest of their companions. One grassland barbarian laid his ear to the ground to listen, and after a moment he rose his right hand up to make a gesture. He made a sign by making a fist, waving it heavily and quickly, which indicated to the companions that many people, including armored cavalries, were approaching from the south. As the bonfire had burned out, under the charred wood was a grey dust covering the still glowing embers. The bodyguards and grassland barbarians struggled to get up, taking out their long and well-prepared single crossbow, and then aimed them down the still dark northern mountain road. Since everyone was still hobbled by their severe injuries and they knew the strength of the coming party, they decided that there was no point in hiding and only to wait calmly to be saved or to be killed. The leaves on northern mountain road rolled along the path as a dozen cavalries rushed out from the dim early morning twilight. The people mounted on the horses were wrapped in very thick black armors. Their horses ran as fast as the wind, and their hooves sounded like heavy thunder, causing the ground to tremble. And as the burning embers vibrated, they emitted little puffs of soot and smoke. These were the most elite black-armored cavalries of the Tang Empire. Wrapped in those heavy armors, once they assaulted first on the battlefield, these cavalries had never met a rival in the world. Even the powerful great sword masters could not effectively inflict damage to these armored warriors. Even if in the dawn light, everyone could clearly see the arrow and sword wounds on the armored cavalries who were rushing down the road, indicating that they had been attacked. Maybe they had encountered an ambush at the southern foot of the hill. In any case, everyone could imagine the anxious mood of the cavalries, who were definitely not equipped for jungle combat but still forced to go overnight through the northern mountain road. A dozen armored black cavalries roared through the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. At the front was a young armored knight, wearing a red cloak. From a distance of around 328 feet, he looked at the people beside the bonfires and shouted, "I'm the Gushan commander, Huashanayu, and I'm here to ask for Her Highness." Hearing the name of Huashanayu, the bodyguard carrying the crossbow arrows suddenly relaxed, loudly responding with a reply. Nink lowered his eyes and looked down at Princess Li Yu leaning on his shoulder. Her eyelashes were moving slightly. He could not help smilingly raising his eyebrows and silently lay down the boxwood bow in his left hand. As fast as lightning, the horse ran full speed, hooves hammering, down the northern mountain road, rolling up or trampling the fallen leaves that covered the road. The young general claiming to be Huashanayu gripped his saddlehead and flew down the road on his horse. He quickly ran to the bonfire so he could kneel down on one knee with hands folded, then in a hoarse voice he said, "I'm responsible for the overdue rescue, which even death can't atone, so I'm begging your highness for forgiveness." By this time, the dozen armored black cavalries had rushed into the forest. With their faces etched with exhaustion, those Tang elite warriors all dismounted and knelt in a queue behind Huashanayu, and said in unison, "Your highness, please forgive us." They had no idea of when Li Yu had opened her eyes. She seemed to have just woken up, or perhaps, she had been awoken for a long time. Li Yu looked at the Gushan commander's senior captain Huashanayu kneeling in front of her, this loyal young general, and all the cavalry who had obviously experienced a bloody battle while rushing here. While smiling she gave an encouraging look and said, "Please, quickly get up unless you really want to accept the punishment." She was so happy to see the Tang cavalries that rushed overnight to help even after suffering an ambush at the southern hill of the northern mountain road. They kept worrying about her life and possible death the whole night. As for the cavalries, how could they not be excited to finally see the virtuous princess after the passing of a year? Huashanayu raised his head in excitement, prepared to say something. But then he saw the princess sat beside the other soldier's shoulder wearing a particularly natural expression. Seeing this scene, he somehow had a slight uncomfortableness in his heart, showing a trace of sadness and unhappiness in his eyes, and slightly furrowed his eyebrows. The moment this young general looked up, Nink, who had been watching the cavalries, clearly saw his face. He had a handsome and cheerful face with sword-like eyebrows, which expressed a bit of intelligence. Huashanayu was very young for a Gushan commander's senior captain and to lead a whole team of armored black cavalries. He was no doubt the most elite and outstanding one among the young people of the Tang Empire, the best one in terms of shrewdness, tolerance, and ability. But, unfortunately, there was always a threshold he could not cross, in which he even fell over himself a few years ago. And this threshold was the love that he had buried in the heart. A love that had long been known by all the Tangs. This was the deepest and the strongest love, for the Tang's fourth Princess Li Yu. Huashanayu suddenly showed a sad mood, naturally, not for Li Yu. Because he wouldn't dare to disrespect the princess, even in this current situation of danger. He was just very jealous of the soldier beside her, thinking to himself, what a bold man, how dare he actually get so close to the princess, who is a high noble. Not just close to her, but almost next to her. He had never been so lucky as to be so close to the princess in his life. And if possible, he could not wait for a time to draw his sword to chop down that lad's shoulder. Huashanayu had hidden this jealousy well in his grim emotion. And he would continue to do so, at least in front of the princess. Thus Li Yu only saw a glimmer of shock and unhappiness flash through his eyes. She hesitated slightly and then felt the warmth coming from her arm, thus understanding the reason for the difference in the young general's eyes. She subconsciously raised her hand to comb her hair from her temple to conceal her embarrassment. She herself had not meant to actually spend a night lounging next to the bonfire while sitting next to Nink. Although it was situational, it was indeed inappropriate for the Tang princess to be so intimate with a young man. Princess Li Yu slowly stood up. So, the maidservant who had listened to the story no longer existed. The warmth of their arms was quickly blown away by the morning breeze. After a moment of silence, Ning shook his head with a smile and looked at the side of her face, suddenly feeling that her eyebrows looked particularly elegant in the morning light, as it reflected off her cheek. To him, she looked much more lovely today than she had the previous days on this journey. Indifference and pride, of course, would not be as beautiful as calmness and grace. But he still felt that the girl in the firelight had had the best look. Chapter 20. Nothing in the snow mountain. Hua Shanao stared at the forest around him and noticed that there were many corpses from both sides. Seeing the blood and other evidence of the fierce fight, he picked up a thin hiltless mini-sword, and he finally realized how brutal the assassin was last night. The color drained from his face with this realization. He gave his subordinate the hint to get the horses ready and said, "Your Highness, the following support troop is already on its way. We should leave as soon as possible." Princess Li Yu nodded in agreement and got ready under the protection of the armored cavalries. Then Hua Shanao glanced at Ning and gave him a cold and emotionless look, the look that was so emotionless it made the others feel cold. He was trying to guess the real relationship between this young soldier and the princess. However, no matter how hard he tried to find a clue, he could not see any potential threats from the young soldier. Therefore, his vision became more and more indifferent. The indifference in his vision actually consisted of multiple probabilities, of which Ning was fully aware. While looking at his back, Ning remembered the previous warmth and gentleness in his eyes. Ning knew that he would not do any harm to the princess and that he was just overprotective. Honestly, the young general's drastic love for the princess had nothing to do with low-ranking soldiers like Ning. However, Ning really disliked Hua Shanao's indifferent attitude expressed by his cold glances. He knew that most of this indifference represented a strong power to support the conduction of a culling operation at any time, but it also represented scorn. Ning did not like him, so he stood up and smiled at the princess, who was about to mount a horse. With his jaw raised, Ning said, "Your Highness, in fact, I have been trying to say something to you since we were in City of Wei." Hua Shanao suddenly looked back at the pretty princess sitting on the white horse. Frowning, she turned around and stared silently at the young soldier standing by the bonfire. She seemed to be blaming him, but at last, she said softly, "Tell me when we return to Chang'an." Hua Shanao asked the head of the bodyguards about the situation, in a whisper, before setting out. Hua Shanao got a general understanding of what the princess had gone through since her entry and Ning's performance in dealing with the assassination attempt. He remained silent for a while and then walked over to Ning. He then said without emotion, "You made a great contribution this time. We'll award you after we're back to Chang'an. Good job, boy." Ning took Sang Sang to their shabby tent and began to pack it up. Sang Sang fastened the big black umbrella to her own back with difficulty. Then she suddenly turned her head up towards Ning and asked, with her eyebrows furrowed, "Young master, did you say you have something to say on purpose just now?" "Yes," Ning replied casually as he cleaned the coagulated blood from his blade. "The guy named Hua Shanao is so hypocritical and boring that I don't like him. So, I look only to irritate him." "Young master, what are you going to tell the princess?" Sang Sang stopped what she was doing and asked curiously. "I don't know." Ning pushed his sword into its sheath and shrugged his shoulders. He said, "After all, I can't say some stupid words, like I have fallen in love with you since the first time we met in City of Wei or I have been crazy about you. But, Senior Captain Hua may think that way, and so may the princess. Idiots think in an idiot's way." "I'm not surprised about that," Ning answered. The little handmaiden looked into his eyes and said sincerely, "Don't you think that you're a bit of a rascal sometimes?" Ning bowed his head slightly, agreeing with her silently. Sang Sang shook her head. After a few seconds, she looked to him again and asked, "Young master, are all the people in the world, besides you, idiots in your opinion?" Ning thought carefully while he was fastening his sheath. After a long time, he answered seriously, "That isn't my problem. The fact is that there will always be many idiots doing stupid things in the world. Specially privileged people like Hua Shanao aren't supposed to be regarded as an idiot. However, as he actually believes he's in love, he's, in fact, an idiot." Sang Sang pointed at herself with her finger and asked seriously, "So, am I also an idiot in your eyes?" Nink looked at her little black face and replied seriously. "You aren't an idiot, you're just stupid." Before the group left through the entryway of the northern mountain, an incident happened. Some of the Gushan commander's cavalries stayed behind to observe the sight. The assassins who dared to try and murder the Tang princess definitely would not have left any clues. Therefore, they did not stay to find evidence, but to protect the corpses. When the support troop arrived, all the corpses would be moved back to Chang'an and buried. This was a rule of the Tang army, did not leave a companion behind under any circumstances. Cyrillic letter Ye. They carefully lined up their soldiers' corpses in the forest. On the contrary, the enemy's corpses were left where they had fallen, waiting to be burned into ash. However, they hesitated when they were going to burn the corpse of a middle-aged scholar in turquoise robe. They knew that he was a great sword master, so they were not sure if they should show him respect corresponding to his status. Hua Shanyu slightly frowned and decided to bury this great sword master. However, at this time, LV Qingchen whispered to him, "The man has already fallen into diabolism." Upon hearing that, the young general's face suddenly turned cold. He looked down at the corpse again, this time without any respect in his eyes. He waved his hand with unabashed disdain like he was driving away a fly. He then said, "Throw it in the fire and burn it with the rest." They went through the northern mountain road from its southern foot that morning and converged with the support troop by noon. Under the strong protection of hundreds of the elite cavalry soldiers, the Tang's fourth princess, Li Yu, and her followers continued to move towards Chang'an. By this point, nobody would threaten her, whether they had come from the Tang or one of the other empires. The days following the assassination attempt, Li Yu and the little prince of the tribe of savages stayed in the carriage, refraining from appearing publicly. Even though there were hundreds of cavalries, the surviving bodyguards and grassland barbarians continued to protect the princess around the carriage, regardless of their wounds. The elder LV Qingchen was in the second carriage. The heavily wounded bodyguards and barbarians were in the following carriages. Nink and his little handmaiden Sang Sang were sitting on their own shabby carriage, far behind the others. At the border of the Gushan commandery, all of the heavily armored cavalries changed into their light armor, increasing their travel speed significantly. While the solid carriages at the front could follow and keep up, Nink's carriage could only barely keep up. A cavalry dropped back to their carriage and scolded them angrily. "You're moving too slow, speed up." Just like before, after they had left City of Wei during the spring, Nink appeared to be sleeping on the shaft of the carriage again. It appeared that he would likely fall off at any moment and that he was entirely dependent on Sang Sang to laboriously hold him up. While being scolded by the cavalry, he just glanced at them without saying a word. As they watched the back of the cavalry as they left, Sang Sang wiped the sweat from her forehead. She squinted her willow-like eyes and then said, "Young master, they appear to dislike us." Good use of the word dislike. If you had said, "We seem to be forgotten," it would have sounded pretentious and showy. Nink towards the first horse carriage and thought about the princess, whom he had not seen since leaving. He smiled and said, "For poor people like us, who to struggle to survive, any pretentious or showy expressions are considered nasty." It had been like a fairy tale, sitting with the princess by the bonfire. Such an idea, regardless of being in Chang'an or on the grassland, would have been just a fantasy and never real. In fact, if a little soldier from a border town happened to rescue a noble, they would receive an award accordingly. Then they would never interact again, and that was the story of reality. There were epic heroics in the world. However, there were not fairy tales. If Romeo had not been a noble's son, but simply a garbage man, Juliet would have been more hesitant to die for him. Nink had always had a clear understanding of such things. He knew that the girl he saw by the bonfire was just an illusion. Most importantly, he had never really been emotionally touched. He only appreciated the fact that a princess could relax like that. Therefore, he did not feel any regret. The team did not rest for even a moment after resupplying at the Gushan commandery. Instead, they chose to keep moving southwards. The princess was clearly rushing to go back to Chang'an and find her lovely father. Hua Shanyu did not misinterpret Nink's relationship with the princess, as he had investigated Nink's background and found out that he was just an ordinary soldier from the border town. Clearly, nothing could ever happen between them. Therefore, Nink was not concerned during his stay in the Gushan Commandery. After making an encampment so they could rest, Sang Sang went to a nearby river to collect water, wash the rice, and kill some fish, so she could make a large meal for dinner. The young master and the little handmaiden scooped food from the main dish into their bowls and started eating happily, adding several sauerkrauts and peppers. They did not stop eating until they were full and content. A cold and harsh man walked into their tent, but when he saw this he shook his head and smiled. "We asked you guys to eat with us but you declined. We thought you resented us. But, as it turns out, your dinner is far better than ours. You're lucky to have such an intelligent handmaiden." It was obviously an exaggerated compliment. But Sang Sang didn't say anything. She just smiled and continued to eat, while Nink felt that it was an obvious fact. The man was named Pengu Oteo and he was the head of the Tang's bodyguards. He performed well during the bloody battle on the northern mountain road and had won the trust of the princess. He brought his subordinates and followed the princess to the grassland for the year. On their way back they had encountered several ambushes. Only 7 of his loyal subordinates remained and this deeply saddened him. They had become comrades while fighting together on the northern mountain road and this had made their relationship more solid than usual. Besides, the outstanding performance of Nink certainly had left the people who had been present with a deep lasting impression. As a result, the carriage that was disliked by the cavalries of the Gushan Commandery was frequently visited by Pengu Oteo and a few other bodyguards these days. The barbarian soldiers also sent some spirits to Nink and Sang Sang as gifts. However, they rarely came closer than a distance of 100 feet and barely spoke to Nink and Sang Sang. Perhaps they were scared after hearing the story of Shubi Lake. "I know you can make it back to the city by yourselves, and I know you guys are unwilling to travel with the team. But there has still been no reply about the submission of your request." Pengu Oteo looked at Nink apologetically. "You're a soldier sent from City of Wei and we can't let you go without her princess permission." Nink scratched his head and said, "Then I'll continue to go with you for a while longer." Nink had expected the rest of the trip to Chang'an to be boring and uneventful. However, he suddenly received an invitation from the second carriage on the following night. LV Kingchen wanted to meet with him. Nink was both surprised and happy. He scowled as he thought about it for quite a while. Then he decided to be nonchalant and he put out the bonfire next to his carriage before walking towards the second carriage with Sang Sang. The curtain had been lifted and the carriage was dimly lit by a candle. The Psyche Master, LV Kingchen, watched Nink and his young handmaiden bow towards him respectfully. He was surprised. He had reckoned that the lad understood why he had been invited. He would not enlighten him about the subject if there was a third person present. Hadn't the young man considered that? Then the elder remembered the story he had overheard by the bonfire when they were at the entrance of the northern mountain road. Although he was meditating, he couldn't help but eavesdrop. The story had been about a boy and a girl, who had struggled to survive in the vast and dangerous Min Mountain. LV Kingchen realized why Nink had brought Sang Sang along with him. At this realization he was pleased and he liked Nink even more. Although, Nink hadn't considered that. It was just a deep-rooted habit to bring Sang Sang with him. "Do you know the reason why I want you here?" the elder asked warmly with his hands folded and resting picturesquely on his knees. Nink was speechless. Immediately, he pressed his left fist into his right hand and knelt to the ground. While kneeling he lay his wrapped fist to the ground and bowed until his forehead was touching his bald hands. This was the most sincere show of respect in Tang Empire. This type of gesture would often only come after a great favor. Even though LV Kingchen had not done anything yet, and even if he wasn't able to help him, it was really a generous and noble act of a cultivator to help an ordinary person that had no obvious potential. Only people like Nink, who had memorized the entire article on the response of the Tao but still couldn't find his way to it, would realize that. It was a place where only those with abnormal talents got access to. Although Sang Sang did not understand this action from her young master, she also bowed in front of the elder. Seeing this, LV Kingchen smiled and rubbed his beard. He then lifted Nink up and closed his eyes, concentrating. He placed his hands on Nink, one on his chest and one on his back by his waist. A moment later, the warm candlelight within the carriage became blurry for no apparent reason. It was almost like there was a quickly moving dust swirling through the air. There was a dead silence and the time flew by without notice. The light in the carriage started to regain clarity and strength. The elder gradually took back his hands and stared at Nink, who was wearing a tranquil expression. There was no anticipation in his eyes, but his hands were shaking slightly as the elderly man sighed softly. There is a breath of heaven and earth. It's the so-called primordial key. A cultivator is able to detect it if he has a strong psyche. Therefore, it depends on your strength of psyche to decide whether or not you're able to cultivate. When I first met you in City of Wei, I discovered no breath of ki in your body. Today, I thoroughly checked inside your body, and I was right. There's nothing in your ocean of ki and snow mountain. Absolutely nothing. End of part 1. Novels Hall Dynasty.